record. All right.
Okay, I guess I gotta got it, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Okay.
All right. It is June 17th, 2023. It is 3 p.m. Eastern, 1500 hours. For you Pacific Coast folks, it's 1200. I am fortunate to be with Dennis Fisher, Earl Gerheim, and Steve Bernston, Vietnam veterans, United States Marine Corps, combat correspondents, and photographers. Gentlemen, how are we today?
Doing good.
Tops,
Just
absolutely tops.
Outstanding. Well, to give my viewers an introduction, they know who I am. We'll start with Dennis, and then we'll work our way around. Introduce yourselves.
Yeah, my name's Dennis Fisher. I served as a combat photographer with the 1st Marine Division in Vietnam, and went over there as a 20-year-old, or actually a 19-year-old Marine, and served there from December 66 until August of 1968.
All right, Earl.
I'm Earl Gerheim, and I served in the Marine Corps from 66 to 68. And I was in Vietnam as a Marine combat correspondent from 67 to 68, and got tremendous experience. I worked on the base paper at Quantico, Virginia for a year before I went over, which was a broadsheet paper. So I learned newspaper design, how to do how to design pages, size photographs. Then I was a correspondent. I had no idea that this would later pay off in life. I just thought I was putting my time in, and I gained absolutely fantastic experience, which I later put to use as a professional journalist. I also had a lot of time in academia. I retired early and done until I had some medical issues, did a lot of various volunteer work everywhere. Central America, Spokane, you name it, I was in a lot of places.
Wow, that's incredible. Steve?
Well, yeah, I joined the Marine Corps for a 2-year enlistment in September of 65, with the idea that, I could get 2 years and get out fast. Of course, the Marine Corps just opened up that 2-year program because they were short of men, but you didn't understand that when you're 19 years old. And so I go in and I go to boot camp, and I survive that adventure. And the next thing I know, that they've called us out early in the morning, standing outside the Quonset huts that had no heat, and said, all of you from A to G stand out on the left-hand side of the road. I got off on I was B, didn't take long to figure out which side of the road you were going to be on. And so I get on my side of the road, and this captain comes up, and the first thing he says is, the smoking lamp is lit. Well, shit, you're in trouble once that happens, because nobody's going to give you a free cigarette. And the lieutenant that came up in the Jeep said, due to a critical shortage of machine gunners, MOS in the Marine Corps at this time, you've all volunteered to cross-train as a machine gunner. And I wasn't the first guy to have the hand up. I think I was second, though. And my question was, how do we get out of this? Because I did not want to be a machine gunner. And he said, well, you're going to have to, we'll send a truck up to get you guys that aren't happy about it, because you're 2-year enlistees. So I ended up going down. Then next thing you know, I had to sign up for 2 more years to get out of the machine gunner MOS. And then the guy that was doing the what they call him, the career advisor. I told him, I said, well, before I came in the Marine Corps, I worked on a couple of newspapers, and I've had some experience, taking pictures and writing stories. And he said, well, the Marine Corps didn't have that. I said, well, geez, you got the Camp Pendleton Scout there on your desk. Where do you think that comes from? He says, it's here every Friday morning. I said, well, there's got to be Marines that put it out. Anyway, after I finally kept hanging up on him, he finally said, okay, I'll call and get the MOS. He called and well, you can qualify for 4312, but you're going to have to sign up for 2 more years. And I thought, well, I just finished going through machine gun school, and I figured there was a reason for the shortage. So that's how I ended up
Well,
being in the Marines and being assigned as a combat correspondent.
Well, it's an honor to have the 3 of you here. So what led you gentlemen to the Marine Corps? Dennis, I'll start with you.
Well, actually, I was studying photojournalism at the University of Miami down in Florida. And Wilson Hicks was kind of my mentor down there. He was a former picture editor for Life magazine, and the university had hired him to kind of whip the school newspaper, school magazine, yearbook and stuff into shape down there. And he started and actually became an international conference on photojournalism. So, you know, I loved photography, and I managed to get a job there as a photographer, just to earn a little extra money and at the university. But I never considered making a career out of it. You know, I wanted to be I loved chemistry and the sciences, and I love scuba diving, so I was going to be an oceanographer. But as things turned out, I ended up spending my entire life as a photographer. But at any rate, what led me to the Marine Corps, one of my good friends at the university was in the platoon leader classes program. It was kind of like the ROTC, only for the Marine Corps. It was an officer training program. And he tried to convince me to join the Marines. My father had been in World War II, and my grandfather in World War I, both in the Army. And so I was kind of thinking about Army all the time. But Ron Sarin, my friend there at the university, he kind of talked me into looking at the Marine Corps. And as things turned out, after a year at college, I ran out of money. My parents really didn't have the money to keep me in college. They didn't have a lot of money. And the Marine Corps had a 3-year enlistment program, and I could get the GI Bill for 3 years to finish college when I got out, never considering the fact that I may not actually get out alive anyway. And so that's kind of what led me to the Marine Corps. But when I came out of boot camp, I went to boot camp on the East Coast at Parris Island. And when I finished boot camp, despite all the testing we had done and all the knowledge, skills, and abilities I had, I was assigned an 0311 MOS, which is infantry rifleman. And frankly, you know, that's where the kind of glory was in the Marine Corps. You know, nobody wanted to be an administrative clerk or a cook or something like that. You wanted to be a mortar man or a machine gunner, like Bernie was talking about. So at any rate, when we finished boot camp, we were assigned our MOS, and I was off to advanced infantry training at Camp Geiger. Now, had I been assigned a photography MOS, I would have been sent off to photography school, but that didn't happen for me, and I didn't get into photography until one of those admin clerks that I was just speaking about managed to screw up my orders. When I finished training on my way to Vietnam, we had some final training at Camp Pendleton, and I had been assigned to the 3026 training replacement training squadron or company there. And when they shipped us off to Vietnam, the clerk on my orders transposed the training unit number 3026 for my MOS. And nobody knew what a 3026 was. And so when I got to Vietnam, they just had me listed as unassigned. And I was assigned because of when they found out what my real MOS was, they assigned me to a security platoon, which just happened to be up the hill from the photo lab, which I walked by frequently. And I started making friends with those guys. And to make a long story even longer, after 6 months in country, I finally managed to get a transfer into the photo lab, but I had to extend my tour in Vietnam for another 6 months just to do it. And that wasn't without some consternation and stuff, but at any rate, yeah, actually, when Steve was talking about career advisors, when I went to the career advisor to put in an AA form to get transferred into photo, he said, you got 3 options here. He said, you can finish your tour. You only got 6 months left, 6 or 7 months left. You can finish your tour and go home here in the security platoon. Or you can go to officers school. In boot camp, I had qualified. I was one of 3 guys in our company to qualify for officers school, but you had to be 20 years of age at the time you would have completed officers school. And I would have been I would have graduated in December of 66, and I wasn't going to be 20 until January. So they told me to reapply at my next duty station, but I didn't. Things got so busy and got sent off to Vietnam. So that was kind of on the back burner, but that was now an option. He said, we can pack you up and send you back to the States next week to officer school. And I said, well, okay. He said, but if you go to photo, you're going to have to extend for 6 months. And so I put in for the photo transfer, and he said, you'll get some orders. And I waited and waited. A month went by. And finally, the first sergeant in security platoon there says, hey, Fisher, you got your orders. I said, ah, great. I went up, and it was orders for 2-5, which was an infantry, an infantry line company. And I thought, well, I guess the photo thing didn't work out, So I went down and told the lieutenant at the photo lab. His name was Lieutenant McKay. He was a Mustang, an officer who had come up through the enlisted ranks before he became an officer. And he was really good. And he knew how the Marine Corps worked. He said, don't give up yet. He said, I'll talk to those guys. But, I was already checking out. I mean, I was getting ready to leave. My duffel bag was packed, and I was going around to the various organizations you have to check out with when you leave an organization. And sure enough, 3 days later, I got orders for photo, and 2 sets of orders, one changing my MOS to photo and another one assigning me to the photo lab. So I got into photo kind of through the back door. And at first I felt a little out of place there because all these guys had formal training and I had none. All mine was just on the job, practical experience kind of training, but it paid off, and I did okay over there.
Phenomenal. The links it took you to get to photo, and all the possible things that could have happened, especially with getting assigned to 2-5. Earl, what led you to the Marine Corps?
Well, my father had been a Marine officer in World War II, and he had commanded a company in the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines. And 2-3 was under the control of the 1st Division when I was in Vietnam. And I got 2 Purple Hearts with the same battalion my father had been a company commander with in the Pacific. I was with Echo Company. He commanded Fox Company. And so that was a coincidence there. So I didn't think of ever going in any other branch of the service. So I enlisted in the Marine Corps my senior year in college. I was getting a BA in political science, and I went to officer candidate school. And I got kicked out 36 hours before I was to receive my commission. I won't get into it, but they were justified. Let's just put it that way. I bear no grudges on them booting me out.
Yeah, but their loss was the Snuffies' gain.
Well, one of the first things I did after getting my arse kicked out was sell my 2nd lieutenant spars to some other lieutenant for beer money so I could go into town and try to drown my sorrows. Well, I got put in, you're given an MOS. I get this MOS, I'm a 4312. I said, what in blazes is that supposed to be? Look, it's press information man. So I report to the information officer at Quantico. And they say, where'd you come from? I said, well, well, do you have a journalism degree? I said, no, I never took a class in my life. So they put me on mess duty for 30 days, which is like a 110-hour week, slinging hash in the mess hall until they could figure out what to do with me. So I get off of mess duty and I report back to the information office and to a Master Sergeant Mel Jones, who I found out later is a legend, fantastic writer. The guy had been highly decorated in Korea. He was like the epitome of the old Marine Corps top sergeant. And I go in and he says, I got your record here. He said, from now on, your time in the Marine Corps starts now. I don't care what you did in OCS, but you must have really screwed up here. Yes, I did. And he says he's looking at, they had the results from my officer qualification test. And he said, I think I know why you're here. He said, you know, your math scores are terrible. I said, I know that. He said, you've got some of the highest verbal scores they'd ever seen. That's probably why they put you here. So they assigned me to the base paper, writing sports, doing features. I learned, you know, I spent a year there working on, it's a full-size paper. So I learned, you know, got to do a lot. Then I kept putting in to go to Vietnam. I didn't want to be in the Marine Corps during a war, you know, in the States. I mean, that just isn't what you do. So I finally got orders there. And by the time I went through staging and an orientation course for correspondents photographers at Camp Pendleton. So I get assigned the 1st Marine Division, and I knew all the names because, see, we'd gotten all their stories that we ran, you know, in the base paper. So it's like Steve Bernston and Tom Donlin and Mike Stokey. And I mean, I knew the names of these guys. So I report in, and I walk into the hooch at Division Rear, and they had a roster there with this plastic overlay on it and had little purple stars denoting Purple Hearts. I went, holy mackerel, look at all the Purple Hearts these guys have. I mean, obviously, you know, they're in a lot of action. And so normally you spend a month there at Division, you know, doing what they called the Fleet Hometown News releases, kind of learning everything. Well, they needed somebody. So I got sent down my 4th day to the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, south of Da Nang. Well, one of my colleagues, Gordon Fowler, had been with them. Gordon had been with them on Operation Swift, which was, I think the Marines had more killed in 5 days than we had in the whole Way City operation. And Gordon had quite a reputation. He was both a broadcast correspondent and print. And Gordon had been put in for a very high decoration, got a 2nd Purple Heart. So I get to 3-5, and I'm a new guy. And that's a whole culture, the new guys. You're scared of them for the simple reason they screw up. They don't know anything. You got to watch them. Well, and I get there, and I'm known as Gordon Fowler's replacement. So they thought I was okay, because they thought, if I'm replacing Fowler, I must have something going for me. I really didn't, but, you know, and I just fit in right there. I learned, you know, you go up where I was not there to compete with Time Magazine or the New York Times. We were there to do stuff on individual Marines and actions that would be like in the Sea Tiger, and of course, all our stuff went to base papers in the United States. There's always the conflict there. You do some major paper story in Vietnam, and it wasn't the Sea Tiger, but it was in the Camp Lejeune Globe, like, you know, whatever. So that's how you did things. And you wound up going out where the stuff's going on. And by then I'd had enough experience in the States to know how to do story, you know, how to talk to people and everything. Well, I get out of the Marine Corps, and I had no intention of ever doing anything in journalism. I wanted to teach political science or history at the community college level. Well, I get out, and my wife, who had a year left of college to do, so I had to wait for her to graduate. So I'm going back to school, and I see an ad in the paper that the Port Angeles, Washington, they're looking for a sports editor. Well, I applied for it. I go in, they say, where you been? My gosh, we're glad to have someone like you. And I realized that all these people with their BAs in journalism couldn't compare to what I learned OJT being in the Marines. You know, was something. Then I later got on with the Associated Press, and I moved back. I was in New York for several years. I moved back to Spokane, worked for the paper here. But it's something, I got a career out of something I never even had a basic formal course in. But Marine Corps gave me fabulous experience. And I was always good at being able to interview people, even under less than optimum circumstances. Well, when you're in Vietnam with these grunts and everything, you learn to talk to people under difficult circumstances. And I think that was the biggest thing, was I learned how to talk to people and interview them. Uh, I worked in New York. I covered sports. The level I worked at, I'm just going to say this, I'm not trying to brag, it's a fact. I was the first reporter to talk to Joe Frazier after he lost his title to George Foreman in Kingston, Jamaica. It was the first one in the locker room.
Wow.
And Joe's sitting there. He's bleeding out of the mouth. I walk in, he goes, Earl, how you feeling? I said, well, Joe, I was going to ask you that. Now, he just lost the biggest prize in sports, but I sit down and I can talk to him. You know, you don't get in their face, say, well, what's the first thing in your mind, man? What are you thinking? You know, things like that. And the experience I got was unbelievable, you know. And I guess the funny thing is, I had no idea that this was going to pay off later. You know, I saw myself at Tacoma Community College teaching comparative government or something, you know. And I wound up doing that and making other career changes. But I think what I got to do in the Corps got me enough that I could bounce. I could always land on my feet somewhere. I did an academic stint and then went back to journalism. And, you know, I had to thank the Corps for that, you know.
That's phenomenal career that you've been able to have over the years. I've read some of your articles and the writing is fantastic. And it's incredible to think that a lot of that foundation came from your time in the Marine Corps. And I think that's something that's not talked about a lot is how the Marine Corps did indeed help prepare a lot of you for your futures, especially for you guys that were correspondents and photographers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Bernie, what led you to the Marine Corps?
Well, other than running from the draft,
Yeah,
I had a favorite uncle that had been a Marine, and so when I knew that I was going to get drafted, and I walked over to that little office down in the Spokane post office because I was living in northern Idaho at the time, and basically, you know, the first sergeant said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Well, my uncle was in the Marines in Saipan and Tinian, and I was just wondering about that because my uncle never, you know, it's like all combat veterans, you never really talked to anybody about it except somebody had been there with you." And so anyway, you know, it didn't take long before my 2 years in the Army got changed to 2 years in the Marine Corps. But I was fortunate in, like I said, I told a story about, you know, being a machine gunner and having to re-up to get into the MOS. And the MOS was easy for me because I already worked on a couple of newspapers, you know, weekly, not a big deal, but enough that I had the skills. And as Earl said, I knew how to talk to people. And so I got assigned to El Toro, Marine Corps First Aircraft Wing down in Santa Ana, California, where I started basically my military journalism career. And you know, I already knew how to lay out pages and crop photos and things like that, but I didn't understand, you know, you got to know the essence of the organization you're in. And so, you know, fortunately, I rose from sports writer, which I didn't understand other than the fact in 1965, all you had to know about sports was in El Toro was that the Hawaiians won the crown playing Marines, and the Hawaiians were the best volleyball players. So all I had to do was write about volleyball, and but I learned my skills there the first year or so I was there, and I kept putting in for Vietnam, and I kept getting turned down. And I hadn't been to DIMPOS, which was the Defense Information School, and that was supposed to certify you as a correspondent and a writer. And so I was putting in to go overseas, and of course I got married. And shortly after I got married, I got orders, which is how you get orders. If you want orders, just get married. You know, then you get them right away. You know, so I was fortunate enough to get bounced around, and I went to. I was assigned to Okinawa first for a 3-year duty, but I got there, and the day I was checking in, there was noon hour, and all the staff people were out at the mess hall, and there was this major sitting there. And he said to me, he said, what are you doing here? And I said, sir, I'm checking in. And he said, what are you checking into? I said, I'm checking into the informational service office, which is across the hall. I've already met up with Staff Sergeant Benavente, who I knew in El Toro. And I was just checking in. You get my paperwork done. He says, what's your MOS? I said, it's 4312, sir. He said, well, just a minute. He takes a clipboard off the wall behind his desk and he starts flipping through it. He said, oh, yeah, we had a request from 1st Marine Division ISO in Da Nang that they needed a 4312 if we had any. He said, you a sole surviving son? No. You have any brothers in Vietnam? No. He said, is there any reason you can't go to Vietnam? I said, my wife's pregnant. He said, that doesn't count. And so at the end of the day, I went from Smedley D. Butler back to Kadena Air Force Base. And the next day I was on a flight to Da Nang. And like Earl was saying, you drag yourself all the way up this hill and you don't know what.
Hello?
Lost your audio.
Oh, yeah. I can hear you, Dennis.
Yeah, I can hear you, Earl.
Okay.
There
Anybody
you
hear
go.
me? Or
Yeah.
am I censored again?
No, you're back.
Okay. Anyway, long story short,
Whoop, we lost you again.
what did I do?
Your audio keeps cutting out.
All right.
Now we can hear you.
All right. I'll try to be online here. Everybody okay?
Yeah.
We're good.
And we just lost you again.
I
Well,
don't know what's going on, Bernie.
while he's trying to fix his technical problem, he mentioned about being drafted or trying to get away from the draft.
Yeah.
When I was in the induction center going into the Marines, they hung a sign around our neck said USMC. You got to go to the front of all the lines. They wanted to get the Marines through there fast. Well, on this particular day, I guess they were short of the number of Marines they needed for their quota there. And they started picking draftees who were there to be drafted into the Army. And they started picking out the biggest, toughest looking ones and putting the Marine signs around their neck and bringing them over to our side. And you talk about a sad looking bunch, man. They not only didn't want to be in the Army, they really didn't want to be in the Marines. And,
that happened to a buddy of mine I knew later. Was one that was selected to volunteer to be drafted by the Marine Corps. Yeah. And he later got very seriously injured. Now, he was a demolitions engineer. Well, Gene's telling me he's at the induction center and he's a big guy. The guy's as big as a house. So they're going through, just like you say, Dennis, they're looking at the baddest looking dudes they can get. So they grab Gene and they call him in. And Gene said, well, I think we ought to tell the Marine something. He said, I've got an assault conviction. And the recruiters say, well, we'll pull some strings.
Yeah, right.
And they're thinking, oh boy, that's the guy we want.
Yeah, right.
Well, interesting enough, like Dennis was saying, when I enlisted in the Marine Corps and I got to the induction center there on 2nd Avenue in Seattle, and we were led into the room and we all knew we were supposed to take the oath for the Marine Corps. And the captain was getting ready to give us an oath when the first sergeant came in and said, one moment, sir. And they brought in 6 guys and they said, these are the people that we've selected to fill out our quota. And this one guy says, wait a minute. What do you mean quota? I'm here for the Army. I'm not here for the Marine Corps. How did I get in the Marine Corps? I want to be in the Army. And this first sergeant said, let me explain it to you, turd. The situation is you were signed up for the defense of the nation. Doesn't make a difference. If we need you, we'll get you. So congratulations, you're in the Marine Corps. Well, I found the same guy was in boot camp with me. And they beat the crap out of him a couple of times because they found out that he kept saying, I'm not supposed to be here. I was supposed to be in the Army. That was interesting.
Speaking of boot camp, what was boot camp like for the 3 of you gentlemen?
Hell,
Yeah, boot camp
Living,
was
living hell.
if you saw Gus Hasford's read his book or watched Full Metal Jacket there, it was pretty much like that, because that's the same time I went through boot camp. I went through boot camp in '66. Of course, I was Paris Island. I don't know, Earl, if you went.
Us Holly Marines had ice cream every Saturday.
Yeah, right. But it was pretty much like it's been depicted. It was tough. It was tough, and I especially felt sorry for. We had one guy in our platoon. His last name was Millard. I'll always remember him, and he was too heavy. He just wasn't keeping up, and he was trying his best. But when you had to do the rope climb and some of these other more difficult physical things, he just wasn't hacking it. So they sent him to, we called it the fat body platoon. It was the motivational platoon, and they put him in there, and it was to get the weight off him. And there was a whole bunch of these guys, and we'd see them when we were out doing our stuff. They had this mountain of sand, and they had these buckets, and they would move this mountain of sand from one place to another. And then they just fed them. We'd see them in the chow hall, they just giving them weeds and seeds kind of stuff, not really much stuff. And the weight melted off them. And I remember seeing him at graduation. He eventually got into another platoon, and I was at graduation. He wasn't, but we marched by these guys, and I saw him, and I couldn't hardly recognize him. I know his parents probably thought the Marines had worked some kind of miracle on him, because he was in super shape by the end of it all. But yeah, other than that, the only experience that I had that really stuck in my mind, we were out at the rifle range for qualification, and I was a good shot. I mean, I'd been on the rifle team in high school, and I lived in the country in Pennsylvania, and we were out shooting all the time. But at any rate, when the first week of snapping in and practicing was going on, they give us a break to go to the head and stuff, and you take off your shooting jacket. The procedure was you take off your shooting jacket, lay it on the ground, you take your rifle, you pull the bolt back, lock it back, put the weapon on safe, lay it on top of the jacket with the operating handle up, and you go do your stuff. Well, when I came back, my rifle wasn't there. And I thought, oh shit. Because what that means is while you were gone, the drill instructors were going around looking at everybody's rifle to see if it had been properly stowed there. And mine wasn't. So I go up to the instructor's shed there, just a bunch of wooden benches, and he says, "Find your rifles, maggots." And so I grab my rifle, and I'm standing there kind of at port arms, and he's going down the line. He comes to the first guy, what did you do wrong? And he tells him, and he says, "Give me 1,000 push-ups." Well, of course you can't just do 1,000 push-ups. You have to pay them back, 50 or 100 at a time until you pay the full 1,000. I hated push-ups. And so he finally gets down the row to me, and he says, "What's wrong with your rifle, Private?" And I said, "The safety's off, sir." He said, "Well, put it on." So I reached down and snap it on, and he says, No, take it off. I did. And he says, "Put it on with your nose." Well, you can't. If you know how an M14 rifle is, you can't put it on. So you kind of have to cheat and use your teeth and stuff. But at any rate, I put this on. He grabs the rifle from me and takes a look at it, gives me a vertical butt stroke right in the chest, knocks me ass over tin cup over a couple rows of these benches, and I'm laying there on the ground, and he just tosses the rifle down at me. He says, get back with your platoon." And I was actually happy that I didn't have to do any push-ups. I'll take getting the shit beat out of me any day, rather than have to do all these push-ups. Yeah. So that was the one thing in boot camp that I remember. And I do remember that after our pre-qualification day, all the guys who didn't qualify, they were really given a hard time by the drill instructors, because as a Marine to go unqualified with a rifle is really a sad note. And drill instructors, they wanted 100% qualification. So I fired expert in the end, so it didn't matter. But these other guys had kind of a rough time of it.
what I remember, Dennis, and you were alluding to it in boot camp. You had the fat farm, the motivation platoon, and you had the sicklies. Which they weren't qualified for sick bay, but they were the sickies, they called them. But I mean, everybody said, I don't want to screw up. I don't want to end up at the fat farm. I don't want to end up at the motivation platoon because it interrupted your schedule.
Right.
In other words, if you went to the fat farm, that was 2 weeks you had to make up on, and so everybody was saying, I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there because it would set you back your whole platoon. So anyway, that was your big threat was being set back.
Well, my experience having gone to officer candidate school, there isn't the harassment that the guys have, enlisted boot camp, but physically it's tremendously demanding. You got to realize the average officer candidate was 23 years old. Most had some kind of an athletic background. A guy 2 racks from me was the Big Ten champion cross country leader champion. One of the guys was a starting quarterback at Georgia Tech,
Yeah.
so they could really push you. And essentially what they never tell anybody that assigned, you were evaluated strictly as your potential as an infantry platoon commander. The guys I felt sorry for were guys with law degrees who washed out, because any other branch of the service, you were automatically commissioned in the JAG Corps. And hey, they wind up as legal clerks. I had one friend had a law degree from Dartmouth, washed out. They signed him as a legal clerk. And I remember the lawyers in the office there at Quantico said, where'd you go to school? And they said, oh my God, we're not going to even admit where we went. I mean, we got an Ivy League guy there. And it was basically, they were there to get rid of you. I mean, it was a screening type thing rather than a real training thing. Enlisted boot camp, you're part of a team. You're learned to do this. There's a lot of individual. You're an OCS, they judge you individually and everything. And I had boxed. I had 37 fights as an amateur in Golden Gloves. And I remember they had me in one time in the office PTing me because I think I was laughing because they'd said something to somebody. I always got in trouble for that. And the one DI punched me in the stomach. Well, for Christ's sake, I fought a guy who was twice national AAU middleweight champion. I went the distance with him, so this wasn't anything. So he punches me in the stomach. I just looked at him. He said, I bet you think you're real tough. And I said, sir, yes, sir. So he started whopping me in the side of the head. Well, after that, I learned to go into the tank. They hit me in the body again. I acted like I got hurt because I didn't like getting my ears, But it was a totally different concept, there.
Yeah,
and
between OCS and boot camp, there was a different difference.
Yeah, and like
as
I
you
said,
as a Marine in boot camp, you learn to work as a unit, and OCS, you were an individual.
Basically, they're trying to get you to screw up. I mean, that's what it is. And they washed out about a third of the people, which was just the way it was. Somebody told me that was their budget. I mean, they literally could. That's all the lieutenants they could pay. I don't know who knows anymore. But it was a different experience. And then you get out, you're harassed a lot for having had that happen. But then when I got to Vietnam, guy said, oh my God, Earl could have been our lieutenant. I said, oh no, I don't want to do that, and then I realized
not for us.
A real safe MO. Infantry second lieutenant, you better make sure you get your will done before you go to Vietnam. I knew a guy, one of the many platoon commanders I knew, and I was at 3-5, and I don't know what he did. He's a good guy. He was a second lieutenant, commanded a platoon. He did something, and I happened to be at the side of the hooch when he was getting chewed out by the battalion XO, who was a major. And this major said, Lieutenant, I could make things very hard for you. I could put something bad in your fitness report. Lieutenant said, Major, with all due respect, I'm a second lieutenant. I'm only halfway through my tour. I've been wounded twice. What in the hell are you going to do to me?
Yeah. Send me to Vietnam. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. That used to be something when we were in Vietnam. And one of the things I did like is you get away from division rear, and there wasn't the petty stuff, as we called it, because things were too important. Plus, you don't mess with guys that carry guns. There's that might have something to do with it.
Yeah.
But that was something people had always said, you get in trouble. What are you going to do? Send me to Vietnam? I mean, seriously, what could you possibly do to me? Because you're already in that place.
The only thing you could do worse is make somebody walk point.
Yeah. Well, but you learn also, unless it's a booby trap, you get ambushed. They don't hit the point man. They hit in the middle, so they cause more.
Everybody thought it was a lousy assignment, but you realized you were the first one through.
But it's just things like that you learn. And in Vietnam, it was like once I got there and everything, you get the feeling you're never going to leave. You're given a rotation date, but you never think that's ever going to happen to you. I mean, it just seems so far out of reach. And then when they finally do call and say, by the way, here's your flight date, and I remember I was at Task Force, Dennis and I were up there at Task Force X-ray. We worked a lot of ops together. In fact, one time we were up there and the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, which had been weird, they moved them way south to start an operation called Allenbrook. Well, cripes, that was 2 provinces away. It was south of Da Nang. So we wind up down there doing our jobs. Dennis gets his usual array of outstanding photos. I think I got about 6 stories that got published all over the place. We get back and the ISO section of Da Nang, the photo set, want to know what the heck we were doing there. Well, we were doing our jobs. And I think I said something, well, if they were doing what they're supposed to, we wouldn't have to be down there showing them up. That didn't go over real well. But what are they going to do? Send me to Vietnam? That sort of thing.
Yeah, that was, we should mention too that when we were on that op with 3-5, the company that we went out with was led by Fred Smith, who was he was a first lieutenant at the time.
Kilo 3-5, right?
Yeah, Kilo 3-5, and he of course later became the founder, president, and CEO of FedEx. But at the time, he was a rifle company commander.
Best officer I ever served
with.
In fact, while he had any command he had, his unit suffered the fewest friendly casualties and inflicted the greatest casualties on the enemy. He had no compunction if something didn't look right to call in a massive airstrike or artillery or something. And we always had a connection, except in fact, my son works for FedEx Ground, and Fred hired him personally 20-something years ago. So there was a connection there.
Yeah.
Well, the one thing that we're talking around about is, the term embedded. We never knew what the term embedded was because it was never used during our
You're
turn.
just with the guys.
Now it is. Now it's you embed with a different unit. Well, we just wandered from unit to unit that we knew about. Went whichever one was going to the hot spot. That's who we linked up with. And that's how we got. And quite frankly, that's the only way you could have ever gotten the stories and ever gotten the photos that Dennis got. And the story is because you had to be there. You couldn't just wait till everybody came back to the rear with the gear and the beer and say, well, I heard you guys hit some shit out there. Anybody got any stories? The grunts are going to look at you and say, bullshit. You want to know? Come along with us. So, you had to know your unit. You had to work with your unit. You had to blend in with the unit, become part of the unit.
Well, not only that, when you managed to get yourself wounded, you wanted to know that these guys would. Who's that out there? Oh, that's the photographer. Screw him. I'm not
screw him. He's not
risking my life to drag his ass back in. But I'll tell you the one thing I will say that having, being in that security platoon, even though we went out on night ambushes or we ran patrols out into Indian country and stuff, but it wasn't like being with a real line company. And but it was kind of a soft introduction to Vietnam for me. But with all my infantry training, when I did get into photo, that was I considered it an advantage. I understood all their lingo. I knew I understood their plans, what they were going to do, their operations, how they maneuvered and everything. So I could pretty quickly tell where things were going to be happening. And and kind of get myself pre-positioned there. So I having the infantry experience before I went into photo was a big advantage to getting good pictures. Of course, the old adage was the secret to a good photograph is F8 and be there. And so the truth is, it's the same with the stories. The ISO guys, they could get their stories from the grunts when they came back from the field. Chat them up somewhere and find out. But the good guys went out in the field with the grunts and got the story as it was happening. And
I went through a bunch of my clips not too long, they're scattered everywhere. I was never organized. And the best stories I have, I was right there and saw it. I mean, that's just, the way it worked, because you could tell that you got a different perspective, and you talk to the guys. You're there with them when this happens, and you want to get.
Zach, how do I bring up a picture if I want to show you guys something?
You would go to share your screen, if I'm not mistaken. Should be at the bottom, little green arrow. Share your screen. Click that, and then as long as you're sharing the photograph, we'll be able to see it.
Okay, and then let me see what happens here. I was going to show an example of that. I don't know where the hell my share screen is to share. I clicked on share screen. It says host disabled participants. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing. So I guess you have to enable that, Zach.
Try that now. Let's see if we can do it now.
Okay. Okay. So let me see here. I was going to show you an example.
Oh, there's some.
Okay, so the guy in the background here with the Nikonis camera is Rick Lavers. He's an ISO guy who was with me on this op. And here's his story that appeared with my picture. And so this is an example of, how we work together in the field to do these things. I have actually let me see if I can call it up here. Here's a better overall shot where you can kind of see, not very well, but that's Rick back there. You can see his head was cut off in the other photo, but this guy was standing on a mine here, and they were trying to disable it.
I've actually got that sea tiger that features that photograph.
Oh, okay.
Well, what Dennis is saying is we worked as a team. And when we had a good story, and most of the times you had a good story because you were there to witness it, just like the one he shows here with the possible booby trap, is what you did is, you could go and say, I worked a lot with Sergeant MJ Coates, Mike Coates. He and I worked several operations together. And when I would write a story and I knew it was a good story, I'd go to Mike and say, hey, I've got this great story. How about if you get a photo together? And so we would try to coordinate, but then by the time his photo went back to photo, the dang photo, and ours went back to the dang ISO, sometimes they didn't get married.
They'd be
different.
Yeah.
This is a photo of the ISO hooch up at Fubai at Task Force X-Ray.
Hang on one second, Dennis. Can you pull that up bigger? I don't see it bigger on my end.
Well, it's like full screen on mine.
Maybe try sharing it again and see if that works. I'd love to see it.
Okay. Let's see. Stop sharing. Okay.
If you take a bunch of chimpanzees and put them in a room and give them each typewriters, eventually someday they'll come out with a word. It's kind of like us, one day we'll finally.
Is that better?
That's fantastic.
That's good.
So Earl knows I think this is this Donlin?
Yeah.
Someone's got a grease gun.
And Marty Martinez.
That's Marty. Tom
passed away a few years ago.
This is me.
He lived in New York. Tom was one of the first Marine combat corps. He was in Hawaii. They didn't know what was going on in Hawaii. He was there January 31st, got wounded, spent 2 months in the hospital in Japan. At that point, we had no idea how many NVA were there.
By the time I got there on the 2nd of November, Tom had already medevaced,
He
and
was
we still
gone.
didn't know where we were.
I think I might have taken, I got a more of a close up. I had a Dennis. We were going out somewhere. So Dennis went and come shot a case of sea rations. We went through, picked out the fruit, threw out, kept the cookies and stuff to take.
Let me see if I can find that shot you're talking about, Earl. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, while Dennis is doing that, I got a
Yeah.
quick question for you,
Did
fellas.
that come up? Did that come up full screen or not?
Not yet, Dennis.
Okay.
So what was your favorite sea ration in Vietnam? I've heard ham and lima beans was great.
Oh,
yeah,
no.
Yeah.
My favorite was any canned fruit. We also had another tremendous perk with our MOSs. We had unbelievable freedom to move around. We carried repeat travel orders. We had a MOS signed by the chief of staff of the division. Do not interfere with this person. We had press cards. And a couple of days a month, I got to go down to Da Nang. And I would take a sea bag, go to the PX, and buy about $40 worth of canned food. It had chili with the little sterno heaters, cans of pineapple. And I'm telling you,
Vienna
when you're
sausages,
and
Vienna
you're there
sausage.
about 6 days, and you pull out a big can of Dole pineapple rings, it's amazing how many buddies you have all of a sudden. So
Well,
we were able to do stuff like that.
Well, I like.
You knew where you stood with the grunts if they let you have peaches and pound cake.
Right. And
That was trading material.
I like the spaghetti and meat sauce. And
yeah,
I like the fruit cocktail, and I like the beans and weenies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The worst was bone chicken and water. It was worse than ham and mothers, I'll tell you.
It was ham and eggs chopped was
I still have a can of that downstairs I got somewhere.
Oh God, it's still good, I'm sure.
Well, actually, I have a case of sea rations in the garage, and I was going to take them down when I was doing this presentation, and I opened it up, and 2 or 3 of the meals were completely, the cans had exploded, and yeah.
How are
But
the
anyway,
cigarettes?
is this picture of Earl up on the screen? Earl and Dale Dye?
Not yet, Dennis. Might have to go reshare it again. Sometimes it works that way.
One of the things with working with a photographer, I had one guy I liked to work with, unfortunately he passed away, named Petey Wilbur. He was a motion picture photographer and got really good stuff. And when you're out, you still keep a distance to everything, but when you're working with a photographer and he's got a face full of camera and everything, you're kind of looking out for them if they need cover. Well, Dennis carried a submachine gun. So, I never felt I had to help him out at all. I mean, he was his own one-man machine gun section. We got in situations where he's taking pictures, and then next thing I know, he's tearing up things with the grease gun. So
those old infantry instincts are hard to suppress.
Yeah, there was one time we were
all fields of fire.
We were in an area bisected by some canals. That's when we were 127, and there's some concrete buildings. They were all wrecked and everything, and we're shooting back there, and they're shooting at us. And Dennis spotted, I think, an NVA's pith helmet, around a corner, and I remember looking at this corner of what's left of the building. Now the grease gun, that's a 45 caliber slug. That's a pretty good size, and I swear it looked like a jackhammer was taken down the corner of that building. I remember looking at that. Well, he zeroed, I bet that guy, if he isn't dead, he's running like hell to get away from there.
Well, one time Earl and I were at that, what was that, at Lanco, that supply point down by High Vaughn Pass there?
Yeah.
And so Earl had some buddies there. He was looking up his buddies and with the 5th Marines, and I was trying to scrounge some 45 ammo for my grease gun there. So I finally found where the ammo point was, and I was talking to the guy, and he said he always wanted to shoot one of the grease guns, so he grabbed a 50 caliber ammo can, which they use them for other things besides 50 caliber, and it was all full of boxes of 45 ammo, and we went down by the water, and so he threw a piece of wood out in the water, and I started shooting at it with the grease gun, and he had his M16. Well, I think he went through 2 magazines, and my grease gun is still firing away. It's a slow cyclic rate, you know. And then I let him fire it. Anyway, he gave me all the 45 ammo I wanted, but the stuff is heavy, you know. So when we got back to Fubai, I started divvying it out to the guys who had 45 pistols to get rid of some of it. But yeah, the grease gun came about as when I got wounded, I was out with the 7th Marines, and I just had a 45 pistol. And of course, it wouldn't have mattered in this case because I got taken out with a mortar. But at any rate, when I came back from the hospital, and a week and a month's, I was in the hospital for 2 months, and then I went home on leave for a month. And so I'm 3 months out of combat when I came back to Vietnam. And of course, I came back on my birthday, January 17th. And guess what happened, you know, a week and a half, 2 weeks later, is the Tet Offensive broke out. And I thought, you know, if I have the opportunity, I'm going to carry something a little more substantial than a 45 pistol, because there was a lot of shooting going on. And so one of our photographers, John Pennington, he picked up that grease gun up in Hue during the Tet Offensive, the fighting up in Hue, and he decided it was just too heavy to carry around. He was a motion picture photographer, and with the motion picture camera and all the film for that, the gun was too heavy. And he gave it to one of our other photographers, Del Vecchio, you know Del Vecchio, and Del had it for a while. But you know, like Earl was saying, when you're out in the field, all this petty stuff kind of disappears. It's just, you know, doing your job and staying alive out there. But back in the rear, Del Vecchio was being hassled by the officers. You know, is that your TO weapon? Why are you carrying this thing around here? You know, and Del gave it to me. And up at Task Force X-Ray, we were kind of out of sight, out of mind up there. So, but I carried it from from about March of '68 till I went home in August of '68, and it was heavy to carry around. I mean, there's four magazines in a pouch. It had 30 rounds in them each, and plus the magazine in the weapon, plus the weapon itself. It's just a heavy thing. But I figured I was going to have something more substantial than a pistol if the shit hit the fan, and that's primarily why I carried it.
I had a Thompson 45 with 3 clips in a vest kind of thing. We acquired it on Operation Arizona down in July of '67 when we ran into some, you know, if you were going to pick up carbines and grease guns and 45s, Thompson 45s, it was going to be because you were in touch with the VC. So we ended up having a stockpile of weapons we took over as a result of the combat. And this one guy said, well, here, you want the Thompson? And I said, I was young and dumb at that point still. Said, yeah, I'd like to have a Thompson. So he says, here, take this. He gave me the vest with 3 magazines. He gave me the Thompson, which had the wood stock on it. And I packed it for 2 days. And so after 2 days, we were going to sight in before we went on the next bill. And so I took the 45 and I was sighting in a dike and I pulled the trigger and that sucker went straight up in the air. About, perfectly straight up in the air, because I didn't understand the essence of a Thompson was you put your hand over it to hold it down. So I gave it back to the grunt real quick. I said, I don't need this. And I saw
that was the thing when guys picked up souvenirs over there. You had to carry them around with you, maybe for a couple weeks before you could go back to the rear and get rid of them, you know, or stash them somewhere. And so, yeah, Thompson is not lightweight either. It's a heavy gun.
And, but I gave him back the vest with all 3 magazines. And later on, I ran into him and he said, I took the wood stock off to make it lighter. And he says, it still can control it.
Now, Earl, what kind of weapon did you carry around?
My M16, rifle, and I had a 45 pistol I picked up and had that like as a backup. And then I always had 2 or 3 grenades, with me. One of the
I had a picture of you, Earl, with your M16, but I can't seem to get back to my pictures here.
uh,
I don't know what the hell's going on. I'll see if I can find it. I'll bring it up.
yeah, that was the one I think. And in fact, you did quite a job because that was taken at a real distance, and you had to crop and bring it up.
No, you know what that was actually from?
I have to take a break. I'll be right back.
Good, Bernie.
I don't have the negative from that. All I had was a contact sheet that was scanned from a contact proof
Okay.
at 9600 DPI to try and salvage it there.
I think that was on Allenbrook.
It was.
It was, okay.
Now, while Bernie's gone, I'll ask a question for both of you. I'll save one of my other ones. But I've asked Dennis this question. But Earl, what was your opinion of the M16?
Bad. There was a lot of problems with it. Initially, what the problem was they had the wrong type of powder in the cartridges, caused jamming. There are a lot of people lost their lives because of it. There are a lot of incidents. There's a battle for Hill 881 with the Marines where guys were found dead trying to take their weapon down and clear the stoppages. The Marine Corps line, and this was every lifer, if you had a problem with an M16, it was your fault. Well, no, it wasn't. It had very close machine parts. I remember being in firefights where my weapon would not extract a spent cartridge, but was trying to feed another one into the chamber. You would then have to take your cleaning rod, undo the mat, and tamp out like Davy Crockett, with his rifle, tamp out the spent cartridge. On the plus side, when it worked, it really worked. I mean, it threw the rounds out it was very good velocity. I was at times, that thing really functioned well, but it had problems. And like any organization, the military would say, well, the problem is with the user, not the machinery they're given. And it did. There's just too many incidences of it costing people their lives because the weapon malfunctioned. But on the other hand, I'll tell you, when it worked, man, I'll tell you, you could go through, you could put out a tremendous amount of firepower. Oh, there I am. Now,
yeah, there you go.
Now, you look at that, I've been in the field, as somebody said once, you really look terrible. I said, I look like that all the time anyway. So it didn't really matter. I was not exactly the most squared away person.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, you've got a Eagle, Globe, and Anchor tattoo on your left arm, correct?
Correct.
And so what would you typically carry into the field as a correspondent, Earl?
Well, I've got, my fighting gear and stuff. I had a notebook. In fact, I still have my notebooks. They're memo size that you put in a plastic bag. It was a plastic bags they kept radio batteries in, and then a couple pens. And that's plus my camera, film. I usually had film in an ammo pouch or something like that. I took pictures. I was not a photographer. Some of my stuff did get printed places, but I consider myself a picture taker. I'm not in a league with some of our photographers. And then of course, you carry as little as possible. You take the kind of sea rats that you really want. You throw out the bad stuff. You don't want to carry that. You carried health and comfort items when you could get fresh water to use. That was a big treat when you shaved and brushed your teeth. I mean, when you could spare some fresh water.
I had a whole. We used to share the Sunday pack when I was at Echo 2-1. They come in and two toothbrushes, and the whole platoon would line up to use the same toothbrush.
Wow.
And there's nothing like shaving, because you'd find a well, maybe replenish your water supply, and always had the menthol shave cream because it was refreshing, and brush your teeth. You felt like you'd been in a spa, Yeah. I remember one time, you get pretty grungy out there. I can't remember where it was. We were going through, and there were some bunkers, enemy, we were going through, and they mortared us. So I ducked into this bunker. I'm in there, and I thought, oh my God, there's got to be some dead NBA in here. Holy mackerel. Then I realized I was the one emitting the odor. I hadn't, you know, had a shower in about 10 days. You know, fresh water was a premium, and you really, the idea that you're going to skinny dip in a river while on an operation, that really didn't happen that often, because you're in a tactical situation. You didn't want to be in a situation like that. I remember one time on, I think it was Allenbrook, we found a well, and I went with Kilo Cup. And I remember a Lieutenant Reitmeyer, he was our artillery officer. You know, he's part of an F forward observer team. His radio operator, few of the other grunts, and me. So we're there.
I was there too, because I took a picture of the well. The guy's getting water. Yeah.
Yeah. And any rate, he strips down. He's got a can. He's doing a Japanese bath type of thing. And all of a sudden, all this firing started. And the look of terror on this guy's face. Well, he would be. So they get going, and I didn't have this only, you know, for all reason, I only had my 45. So I said, you guys go, and I walked back, you know, covered them getting up there. And by then, some guys went out, found a couple of NVA, and they're having a lot of fun shooting at each other. But, you know, you get in situations like that, you always want to feel that you're gonna encounter you're gonna have to defend yourself. You know, you don't want to let your guard down a whole lot. And one of the things working with Lieutenant Smith's company is Fred's attitude is, if you're going to go out and relieve yourself in the bushes, go like you're going to run into a whole squad of NVA. Take your weapons, the whole thing. He made a lot of use of supporting arms. We get the laws, you know, the little bazooka things. He passed those around for everybody, so that you always had a lot of firepower, at least with him. And I remember on one op, we were the point company, and there's another company commanded by a guy named John Neotis, who got a lot of men killed. I think he was able, and he commanded Lima Company. We went up, and Fred looked across, and he said, "This smells bad. I'm getting an airstrike." Neotis says, "No, you're not. We're going across." Lieutenant, because he was a captain, gets his men on line. They walk into an ambush. A whole bunch of guys got killed.
Yeah.
And Fred, being a real psychologist, there's this one kid, he's been hit in the arm and the hand, and he gets patched up, and he's panicking. He's going, "I want a weapon. I'm going to kill Neotis. I'm going to kill Neotis." And Fred goes, "I'll tell you what, Marine, I need a runner. I'll let you be my runner." And he goes, "Okay, wow, okay, I'll be my runner. I'll be your runner." And, you know, shows you the kind of leadership Fred had. He could really work with people. But I never worked with Lima Company. It's kind of sad their guys never got any coverage, because first time I tried to, he didn't want me out with him. He didn't know who I was. And people were saying, "You're lucky, you know, because this guy is very dangerous." And we
had another one down in 1/7 area called Ding Dong Bell.
Well, Bell got the Navy Cross too, you know, Bell. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the Otis got a company sent up to Way Lake, like the last week away. He had Lima Company because he sent up to Way. They were up to Way.
I didn't know that.
Yes. And by the time the op was over, he had about 30 guys left.
Yeah.
And you know what he did? He marched them back down to Fubai, and then volunteered to take them out into the mountains on a sweep.
After they had worn out in Way City.
Because I knew
down the street without joy.
One of the corpsmen wound up going to Kilo Company. And he was telling me about this. And I said, I mean, this guy, you know, there are a lot of people that, you know, you make bad mistakes in most jobs, you screw up. You do that in combat, somebody's going to go home in a box. And I think this was the great admiration we had for Fred Smith, was he looked out for his men first. And he did a pretty good number on the enemy along the way. And then I couldn't believe it. You know, we got in contact. Heck, Dennis sent him a tape of an artillery fire mission he'd called in, photographs, and we've always been in touch with him. But I had lost touch with him when I was living in New York. Some years later, I'm watching 60 Minutes. They have a thing about FedEx. And there he is. So I call back there and I said, there, you know, you go through their 800 number. And I said, yeah, I'd like to talk to Mr. Fred Smith. The person said, yeah, what's this about? I said, we're in Vietnam together. Oh, okay, just a minute. And Fred had, anybody calls up, says they were in Nam together, you put them through. He was in a board meeting and we hooked up, you know.
Wow.
So it's kind of like, and like I said, my son works for him. In fact, there are quite a few people with a Kilo 35 connection whose sons and sons-in-laws became employed by FedEx.
Earl, one of the stories that you've told, which I think is great about Fred Smith, is tell him about how you were sitting there one night, both, you know, he's the lieutenant, your guys are sitting there in a bunker, and he told you about his master's thesis and why it didn't get.
No, it wasn't a master's thesis. He did a paper for undergraduate economics class at Yale. And he had an idea of this distribution plan where people would send packages and parcels into this one place and they'd go out again. And the professor said it was totally impractical. There was a commercial made many years later. I don't know if you ever saw it. I don't know what the company was. It was something about good ideas come, you know what. And it's kind of funny. It starts out, it's like the 30s. And there's New York mafia guys in the desert. And they're going, hey, we're going to make casinos here. Everybody. And they're going, oh, get out of here. It's not going to work. And then another one, it's supposed to be Fred. He goes up to the professor, Professor, why'd you give me a C on this paper? And the guy goes, Smith, you can have this outfit where all the packages come to one central point, then get redistributed. It makes no sense. It'll never work. And that was got him the idea. You know,
that was the whole idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And he got out, there was family money. He bought this little bitty airline, transported cargo airline in Arkansas just to learn the basics. And then he got some venture capital. We'd lost touch. I sure wish he'd contacted me about investing early on. Wouldn't have been a bad deal, you know.
Well, he invested the payroll one time on a roll of dice in Las Vegas. Right?
He couldn't make the payroll. So he read a book about blackjack, took like the last 10,000 he had, went to Vegas, rolled it into whatever it was. I asked him once about his blackjack system. He said he's never gambled since.
Yeah.
Well,
once in a while, you know, you meet you know people like Fred Smith when, you know, he was a lieutenant, and I had the opportunity to know two really good people that were officers. One was Ron Christmas, you know, in charge of Hotel 25 in Way City, and he was a very good officer because I stayed with his outfit, Hotel 25, all the way on the
Lieutenant General.
south. He became a lieutenant general. Yeah. The other one was 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines Echo Company. Pratt, Captain Pratt. He had Echo Company. He was a man that really like your officer Fred Smith. He would smell something. We went on a couple operations with him where he thought that there was a trap being set up, and he wouldn't follow through. He always was very conscientious. And about 8 years ago, I got invited to a reunion of Echo 2-1. And he personally invited me because he always called me his storyteller because I wrote so many articles about Echo. But they were always in the lead. But he was a great officer also.
Well, you know, Captain Christmas used to be our commander. He was in charge of headquarters service company. When I got wounded, he actually presented me with my Purple Heart there at the hospital.
Cool.
I've actually got that photograph I was going to pull up of you.
Yeah. So
Christmas was a great guy.
He got sent off to the line company, and I didn't think we'd ever see him again. And then Way happened, and he was right in the middle of it. So.
He was badly wounded too. In
Yeah.
fact,
Yeah,
years later, I'm watching a British-made documentary series called The 10,000 Day War or something on TV, and they're interviewing then Lieutenant Colonel Ron Christmas.
Yeah.
So I called Bernie. I said, Bernie, hold it. Bernie said, I thought he'd been invalided out of the Marine Corps. You know, he was so badly wounded at Wake.
his ankle, when they took, well, I was there when they took him out of the place and they medevaced him. His ankle was just barely hanging on with threads.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. People you run
They stayed
across.
in the Marine Corps and rehabbed enough that they had to accept him.
Well, he wound up being a lieutenant general, so obviously he passed the PRT.
Yeah.
Yeah. You talk about a small world in the Marine Corps. When we were back on vacation many years ago in New York, and I'm not religious, I want you to know that. I'm going by St. Patrick's Cathedral. It said Cardinal John J. O'Connor. I said, I knew a Chaplain O'Connor was a Navy commander, rank, like the lieutenant colonel overseas. He was in the States, then he was overseas. And Sherry, my wife, says, well, that can't be him. I said, no. Nah. So I said, oh, the heck with it. So I go up into the Cardinal's office there, St. Patrick's, and I walk in, I introduce say this, and I said, and this priest says, that's got to be him, yeah, because he wound up being a rear admiral in the chaplaincy corps, then got out. And I said, well, I see he got a good job, he's a cardinal and everything. Unfortunately, he was doing something else, so I left a note for him, and I did get a little letter back or something. But you talk about a small world, and it is just amazing. Some of the people you got.
I'll tell you, most of you have seen the picture that Eddie Adams took of the Viet Cong being shot in the head. Well, I ran into Eddie Adams up in Vietnam, and just no more than just to say hi. And he told me that he had been a combat photographer in Korea in the Marine Corps. And so, but he was going his way and I was going mine. And now some years go by, I was working civil service for the Air Force, and we were having a photojournalism contest for the Air Force guys. The winner got to go to Syracuse photojournalism school, all expenses paid. Well, at any rate, they had contacted Eddie Adams to be the one of the judges, and they said, we need somebody to go pick him up. I said, I'll pick him up. Is he at the airport? And they said, no, he's up in Santa Barbara. We're in San Bernardino, which is down east of LA. They said, no, he's up in Santa Barbara. And I said, well, okay, I'll drive up and get him. It's like a 4-hour drive. And so we had a lot of time to talk, in the car on the way back. And it was really, really neat to share experiences. He seemed more interested in what I'd been doing over there and how the Marine Corps photographers were doing and how they did things now compared to how he did them in Korea. So, yeah, you never know who you're going to run into. That's for sure.
Well, see, I worked for the AP in New York. And in fact, while I was there, Peter Arnett, who'd been in Vietnam off and on for years, he was paid as a foreign national because the guild contract didn't cover people outside the continental United States. So when Peter came back to New York as a special correspondent, they had to bring him up to scale. I mean, I was getting paid more in New York than he was when he was still in Vietnam. And they brought him back because, he's pretty famous, and they thought he was going to be this darling for them to introduce to publishers. Heck no, he just found a typewriter wherever it was and banged out a lot of good stories. But I got to know Adams then. And that photograph of General Loan shooting that Viet Cong might be one of the most famous photographs of Vietnam. And it really bothered him because it was always misinterpreted. It looked like a cold-blooded murder type of thing. That wasn't the fact. This Viet Cong was an officer whose men had butchered the family of one of Loan's officers. And they got him there. He went there and shot him dead. And Eddie said that always bothered him. Well, one day I'm getting the elevator, go up to get a cup of coffee, and there's Adams with all these cameras and stuff. I said, good God, Eddie, what kind of shooting? I'm not, I quit. Screw them. I said, what happened? They won't let me go with Nixon to China. I quit. So he walks out, walks up to Times Square, walks to the New York Times, got an opening for a photographer. They're falling all over themselves, you know, Pulitzer winner and everything. He later did go back to the AP. But I remember that, and I thought, man, I'll tell you, when you're famous like that, you know, if I told them I was going to quit, they'd say, well, don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Well, what other questions did you have, Zach? We're getting way off topic here.
Oh, that's okay. No, watching you guys chat back and forth
People
is part of the treat.
Got to know over there. I think the main thing I always felt, and I'm sure the other guys, is you're doing this for the people you wrote about, to get them this coverage. Like I said, we weren't competing with Life magazine or the New York Times. And these guys would just be ecstatic. They, you know, you turn your story in, and 3 weeks later, the Sea Tiger would come out, and there'd be the story with their name in it, and or their picture,
or both.
Yeah, or both, like that. I got a friend I just told Bernie about, Joe Brissell. He was a corpsman. In fact, we were medevac together off of Auburn. We were in the hospital ship together. He was with 2-3. We'd been in touch off and on. Several years ago, he tracked me down. I did a story about him, was in the Sea Tiger, and it got picked up with a paperback book, an anthology of stories called Of Guts and Glories, of just a compilation of stories put together by Marine combat correspondents in Vietnam. And that happened to be in there, so I found it for him. Well, over the years, he lost it. He's having problems. He's got Parkinson's disease, bladder cancer from Agent Orange. He's always had shrapnel problems. So we're always messaging back and forth online. He said, do you have a copy of that? He said, I want my kids and grandchildren to see it. They've never seen it. So I sent the stuff to him 55 years later. And he said, thank you. This is like the kids just were really happy with the story. And it's like, I started doing this 55 years ago, and I'm still trying to, I'm grateful I can still do something for these guys. And that's what we did it for, obviously.
Well, if I could just add one thing to what Earl was saying, is I was asked years ago, what kind of job satisfaction did you have? You know, incredulous. Yeah, besides the high money. And I said, you know,
Yeah, right.
to me, the greatest reward that I can count on my time as a combat correspondent is when I would write a story, and you'd go back and join up with a unit maybe 2-3 weeks later, and this kid that you wrote the story about, we used to call him the PFC with the big gun from Keokuk, Iowa. You know, he came up to me and he said, you know, that bullshit you wrote about me, storyteller, all that crap you wrote about me. He said, well, I got home and they put it in my paper. Now they're waiting for me at the VFW because they're going to buy me beer. And that was the greatest reward I think I could ever ask for.
Yeah, I look back on stuff I did, and I rate, I think that stuff, what I did there, higher than anything else. And I've certainly done things along the way. In fact, I got interviewed by the Pulitzer Committee about that. And I said, quite frankly, I think that was a highlight of my whole career, was what I could do for those guys. And there are a lot of guys that have cigar boxes filled with their old dog tags, their old ribbons, and some knickknacks they picked up in Bangkok or something. I like to think they've got some crumpled up photograph from the Sea Tiger, one of our stories, you know, that every decade or so, as they're cleaning out the closet, they find that and look at it and remember it, because that's what we did it for. I mean, it certainly was something, and they rated it.
I meant to compliment Dennis about keeping alive our memories by that great photo display that you created.
Oh, fabulous.
That was fantastic. Absolutely. I compliment you.
Well, Dennis did.
Well, thank you.
We went out, we were on an operation with Delta 127. Talk about small world. 40 years later, their former company commander, Pat Kaler, is a retired colonel working for the Educational Service District in Spokane. We run across each other and renewed. Yeah. But These guys, 127, they came over as provisional, unit during Tet. They got bounced around. They got the dirtiest end of the stick. And the photographs, Dennis, gave them a legacy that they normally wouldn't have had. And these guys really did get kind of, the short shrift.
Well, the truth is from that, only actually one photograph was published. It was the picture of Jeffrey Rosen up on top of the pagoda firing the M60.
With the machine gun, yeah.
Yeah, and that was the only one that was actually published from that operation. And I had all my negatives, not all of them. Some of them, were lost while I was in the hospital and things like that. But all these years later, I get this random email. I was working with Red Bull on this Stratos project, and we got I was with Flightline Films on that, and I got this email from this lady to our company email there, wanting to know if what I knew about the death of her husband, who was killed on this Operation No Name 2. And I had a clue how she got a hold of me or found my name, or because I wasn't part of the 27th Marines. I was an attachment just there with Earl for that op. Well, apparently Earl had donated a story about that, or some information about that, in a book that was written by the 27th Marines, and he'd mentioned my name. She tried to track me down, and to make a long story even longer here, I kind of got me to drag out this box of all these old negatives and go through them, and I found the ones from No Name 2, and I scanned them, and I sent her copies of them. I told her I didn't know your uncle who was killed there, and actually he was with Alpha Company and I was with Delta Company. So even though we were maybe only 100 yards apart across a canal from each other, I never met him. And but it gave her an idea kind of what this thing was like. And then the author of the book, he wanted to know what photos I had, and he was going to republish it, which he did. And another book was written, and then they invited me to their reunion down in Charleston. And they asked if I could bring some of the photos that I took to auction off. They're having an auction to raise money to help the guys who couldn't afford to come to the next reunion. So I picked out six negatives and made presentation prints and matted them and everything, and I took them down there, and they were put on an auction table. The auction wasn't for a few more days, and everybody was looking at this stuff, and all of a sudden, when these pictures appeared, one of the guys came out with this Sherlock Holmes looking magnifier glass, and they were going over these pictures, trying to identify who was who in the pictures. And when it came time for the auction, the pictures brought more money than anything else that had been contributed. And I mean, one of the Gold Star wives came over to me. She bought one of them, and it wasn't of her husband or anything, but she came over and she was crying. I mean, everybody was so touched that they could actually see their loved ones here in action as young men, and that's what got me started on trying to track down these guys that I'd photographed and give them presentation prints, that they can pass on to their kids or their family. And it's been very rewarding because they are very appreciative of them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's one of the things that I show my students is the sea tigers. It's photos and stories have been captured from 18 to 25 years old, and they will forever remain that. And that's the work that all three of you did. And it's amazing to see the writing skills with the photography that you were able to produce that, truthfully, I think is forgotten with the work that the combat correspondents and photographers have done. I mean, you guys are just phenomenal with the articles I've read, the photographs, and all three of you being willing to help me in this project. I mean, it means more to me than I could ever say in words.
Well, I'm glad to help you out. And I know it's like we're perpetuating the sacrifices and heroism of these guys we served with. and photographed and wrote stories of. And they're all great people. They're all heroes. You know, I was 23 when I got to Vietnam. So, you know, and a lot of the guys were 18. And I can't even imagine, you know, you know, when I was 18 being put in a situation like that. Because one thing people ask me about combat, I've never known such fear in my life. And anybody that says they weren't scared shitless, they either ought to be in an insane asylum or they're liars. I actually had a fear at times that I was going to pass out. My heart was beating so hard. And you get this taste of grass in your mouth, in your body. I mean, of course, in a way, that's a failsafe. It keeps you alive because you're scared and you might be a little more, you know, when they say get down, you'll get down, you know, you'll try to avoid fire and stuff like that.
Well, one on the same side of what Earl's talking about, you know, if you stay too long and you get into too much combat, you start evaluating whether it's close or not. And sometimes you have a tendency to maybe be a little more daring than you think of because you come through all this shit without a scratch or you survived. And so you get a little numb to the danger that you're really in. But then it only takes one or two things and you're snapped right back to realizing this is for all the marbles and you're gonna die in this if you make a wrong mistake. And that's when you finally deal with your death.
Well, that's part of it. And I used to get scared. You know, we could move around. I'd get scared going over to get a chopper out to an operation. I'd be scared as soon as I got out of the wire. And that was just part of it. It's very terrifying. And it's something you learn to live with. I think later in life, there are things I've been able to roll with a lot of events because nothing compared to that. You know, I've had confrontations in my life. People say, we can cause you a lot of trouble. I say, what are you going to do to me? I mean, are you kidding? You know, things like that. So you learn that, and still, it's like every war. I mean, you know, the average Marine on Guadalcanal was only 19. It's young guys like that, and they're certainly affected by it. There's no two ways about it. I remember one op I was on, and they were trying to overrun us. That's a misnomer. What it means is they got through our lines. I've been in situations, and they all got killed. We weren't subdued. And I remember this kid next to me in a hole named Lopez, who was a Hispanic kid from California. And he got this one NVA and killed him with an entrenching tool. Okay. Kid was 18 or 19. And I always wondered about him. You know, he went home on leave. He's not old enough to vote. He's not old enough to drink. And maybe he put on his Marine uniform. He's very proud. And he's out there at the drive-in with his buddies. And there's some other guys come up and say, think you're tough, don't you? Do they know what they're dealing with? You know, and that's really something for young people to have to go through stuff like that.
That's why a lot of guys had second tours because they came home and inside 30 days they realized they had no place here. They went back to
oh, for heaven's sakes, people they didn't want to come back to pettiness. One of our colleagues, Mike Stokey, Mike Stokey, we call the Arvin. He spent 2 years in Vietnam. He kept extending. Mike could write. He could get stories anywhere. Mike got a Bronze Star and what, 2 Purple Hearts?
One, yeah.
One, okay, but he got a Bronze Star for heroism.
Yeah, we always used to joke he had more time in country than the Vietnamese.
Oh, well, that's what he called him, the Arvin.
Yeah.
He probably had to borrow money to get enough service stars to put in his Vietnam service medal when he came back. So at any rate, Mike also was the kind that didn't go along with military protocol, to say the least. If he'd come back to States, he'd been busted. He never could have adjusted to the stuff. And our MOSs, we had a lot of freedom. We got away with a lot of things. And a lot of the guys just stayed over there because they didn't want to come back and put up with the military.
All the inspections and all this crap. I mean, that's one reason that I didn't stay in the Marine Corps. When I came back after my tour in Vietnam. I still had about 6 months to do, and stateside duty seemed so boring and petty and stuff. It's like, who wants to do this, you know?
I got back at, I knew guys in the Army that literally went from a fire base to their mother's house in 48 hours. If you got out in the Marine Corps, you're on Okinawa for 3 days. Then we get to El Toro, and it was 8 days to get discharged. Now they took us to Disneyland one day. Heck, you don't feel like doing the rides. You go to the hotel and drink in the bar. And then they have all these work details. And they bring some guy over, some staff sergeant, okay, you're going to go over and clean this office up. And everybody go, what are you going to do? Send us to Vietnam. And you get back, you got just enough of the petty stuff to realize you don't want to put up with this type of stuff. And that's what it did. I mean, I couldn't believe some of the stuff there. We had one guy in our group in the morning, he had to line up to get put on details. I think he was a corporal or a sergeant, and he got awarded the Silver Star. And he would stand there, he had a Hawaii shirt, and he pinned the Silver Star on it. And they'd walk by and just look at him and go, we're not going to mess with this guy. No, he's paid his dues. But again, one of the things with our MOS is we did get away with, we had a lot of freedom, and a lot of places, they didn't know where we were from. I mean, if they wanted to get us in trouble, they wouldn't know who to go to do it, which was always kind of fun. I remember I had an incident when I was a patient on the sanctuary, and they said I could get, and they said, well, I said, well, I'm with 1st Division, but I'm assigned to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, and I was 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, and I got hit when they say, who do you belong? I said, well, I guess I belong to the Marine Corps, which is the way I looked at it, is that's what we did. And again, I can't emphasize enough, I think everyone had the idea you're doing it for these other people that are there. And, you look back on it, and hard to believe a lot of them, so many have passed on, so many years have happened. But there are days, and I'm sure Dennis and Bernie would agree with me, you could almost still smell what Vietnam was like, if you think about it.
Wake up early in the morning and you can still smell it.
Yeah.
Well, I think, this is one thing that the photographs and the stories don't really capture. They don't capture the oppressive heat or the smell of the gunpowder or the smell of the cook fires from the Vietnamese, or the body smells. Your eyes are certainly important, but your sense of smell. You can. I know I've been out camping at times, and I get a whiff of a campfire, and it just takes me right back to Vietnam, smelling it like a village fire cooking.
I one time was walking around in Tacoma, around an area downtown that was very heavily Vietnamese, and it was warm, and I was just walking around, and everybody's cooking. Well, my God, it smelled like being in one of the Vietnamese food. And it really took me back. I'm thinking, I better start looking for tripwires now. It's that realistic.
Well, when I go through my photographs and stuff, and especially when I was putting up this exhibit recently, I look at those pictures, and they're like a time machine. It takes you back, and all those other senses that weren't recorded on the picture, those things all kind of come to mind. Another thing was, we always helped with the wounded or anything like that. We did what we could to help out. And of course, there's nowhere to wash up or clean up or anything. And in the evening, we'd have some cold sea rations or something. And when you're eating, you can smell the blood that's under your fingernails or still on your hands and stuff. It just has a certain smell to it. And, things like that, still stick in your mind.
What I remember is when you're moving out wounded or you're hauling back dead, either one, as you were saying, Dennis, the smell of blood, also the touch of it, it was sticky. It
Yeah.
was, I still get a little jam on my fingers when I'm doing my toast. And occasionally I'll remember, what it felt like to grab the remains that were still sticky. The blood was still sticky.
Yeah.
Those things stick with you for a long time.
When I was new, I think first stop I ever went on, we lost 3 men. And they brought the bodies back, and it was going to start getting dark. And it's not emergency medevac, it's routine to get a body. And there were 3 guys, and they were off to the side, covered up with ponchos and their feet sticking up. I woke up in the morning, and they were still dead. I'll never forget that feeling. They were still dead. And the other thing is, I knew they were dead, but I knew their family hadn't been notified yet. Their mom's probably cooking dinner for the family, not knowing their son's been KIA. But I knew, and it just, it was a feeling I always thought about in a situation like that. Bernie and I had a very good friend. He's retired, Jim Kulikin. He's a retired colonel. And he did a lot of things.
Way City, really.
Yeah, he was put in for the Medal of Honor in Wayne and got a Navy Cross. Jim's the one that called down right away and said, "There's a whole damn division up here." And Dank said, "Oh, you're full of it. You're panicking, Captain." Well, when Jim got back, one of the things he did was they gave him a job, charge of an INI unit at a reserve unit in Marin, California.
Marin, yeah, right.
Yeah.
I was at 12th District then.
And he had to do the casualty calls. And I said, we're out. He was living here in Spokane for a while. I said, "Jim," it's kind of cool, being a corporal, I could call him Jim. I thought that was always cool. And I said, "Gosh, I don't know how I could do that. You go there and tell him, 'I'm sorry, your son's dead.'" He said, "No, this was the last measure of devotion I could do for another Marine, is help his family." So he considered that almost a sacred, really, that put it in perspective. As hard as that must be, I'm here to help this family out and smooth everything for the transition, get their son back, make sure he gets honors, take care of the paperwork. And that put it into perspective. I still don't think I could have had the strength to do something like that. But
well, Earl was talking about thinking about the dead and how their families hadn't been notified yet. And when we were on Operation No Name 2 together, that was actually on the Easter weekend. And, I had similar thoughts. You see, we lost 26 men killed in action there in a day and a half. And, you see them bringing back the bodies, loading them on the helicopters and thinking that, the families don't know they're dead yet. And when they are notified, Easter weekend will never be the same for them again.
no.
And these guys aren't going to raise from the dead. They're dead. They're dead.
Yeah.
So
I heard a story. Of course, there's nothing I wouldn't believe about Vietnam. I'm sure you guys might have heard it. I heard a story somewhere of a guy actually got killed on Christmas Eve, and they falsified all the records to make it a couple days earlier so that his family wouldn't spend the rest of their lives thinking their son died, died Christmas Eve. And that was something. I remember the first time you're seeing people like that and realize this is what happens. This is what happens in war. And the idea, there are guys you're living with this. And again, you're getting back to the guys we photographed and wrote stories about. You're doing that for them. And realize the friends people lost. I don't even think about it sometimes. Some of the one of my dearest brothers, there was a corpsman that got killed, and I've never forgotten him, and it's always bothered me, because you meet these people under these circumstances, and then you wind up losing them, and it's very hard for a lot of people. And I don't care what war it's been in, anybody that's fought in combat, you can't have enough respect for them. And, I look at some of the company, I remember going out, I remember on Ellenbrook, Mike companies, they'd had troubles before. They were down like 27 men at one point. Not they were all killed, but they were all, dead or wounded or heat medevac or something. And you're just wondering, what's going through their minds. But at any rate, we got to share that with them, and it's like you had a ringside seat to a lot of things in history.
The one thing that I experienced in Way was the fact that there were two battles for Way. There was the South Side and the North Side, two different 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine or 5th Marines took under Christmas, and the rest of them took the South Side. Then when we got over to the North Side, it was 1-5 had been brought in because 2-5 was exhausted.
Well, they were all scattered.
They were all scattered, and what I was doing, I was still trying to write stories. I would be observing, and I write down stories, get the guy's name. I was going to put it together. And by the time we got over the North Side, I was just hauling ammunition, hauling dead, hauling wounded, because every time I'd write a story, somebody would be dead. So I have a notebook full of names, stories I never got to publish, because basically you interview a guy one evening after a firefight and get a story. The next morning or the next afternoon, he's gone. So it became impossible to do the job.
In Da Nang, next to the Quonset hut, was the 1st Division ISO office, was the CRCC, Casualty Reporting Control Center. And they would we'd get the KIA cards every day to go through and check against the story that maybe Bernie did a story about somebody. He's dead. Well, we can't, so they had to check against
the casualty list.
By the way, when I was back in DC recently, I got a tour, behind the scenes tour. It turns out the chief archivist for the Marine Corps University there is also a golfing buddy of my son-in-law. And one of the things, I asked him, I said, where are all the casualty cards? And he said, well, we've got them right here. You want to see them? And I said, yeah.
Ooh.
So I went over to have a look. I wanted to see, but they seem to only have casualty cards for people who were KIA. I couldn't find any casualty cards for people who were wounded.
There are too many of them.
Yeah, probably. But all those cards are on file there. So
I guess I could take my old notebook and hunt up a few names.
But with all three of you being combat veterans, what is it like in combat that first time? What's your reaction? How do you respond? How do you feel?
Well, I was so scared you wouldn't believe. First time actually under fire. And I think I'd only been in Vietnam 6 days. I just remember being scared as hell and getting down, and I could hear bullets. I could hear the bullets. And I just remember evidently squad leader or something wanted us moved this way. And I went with him, got down, and started firing. I didn't have a target, but you had the general situation. You learn very quickly how to react. You may have had a lot of training, but it's nothing like the real thing, once you get into that. And if you're with these guys, I don't care what your MOS is, that's what you do. And I'm very proud. I think all of us can say, all the guys who were with and everything, everybody acquitted themselves, did what they had to do, because that's what you're trained to do. And
I remember the first op I got sent on, and it was like Earl says, I had 10 days in country, and Union 2 was going on after Union 1. And so they sent me down to locate Bill Christopherson. And I remember leaving on a chopper, going down there and thinking to myself, I don't want to do anything to embarrass myself. I don't want to screw up. I don't want to make it look like I'm useless. And that remained in your mind every time, no matter how many operations you went on. You said, I don't want to screw up. I don't want to embarrass myself. I don't want to put anybody in danger. And that just kind of became my personal mantra every time I went out on an op.
Well,
Yeah,
we also felt,
I didn't feel that, of course, having worked in the security platoon, you know, all we ever experienced was a sniper fire generally, nothing close up fighting. And so when I went out on my first named operation, which was Operation Cochise, the op started in the middle of the night. So we'd been walking for 4 or 5 hours before any contact was made. And you know, the shooting isn't close by. So you kind of, you know, you're getting into something. It hasn't quite arrived at your area yet. But when the bullets finally do start flying in your area, my first reaction was, what the hell are they shooting at me for? I'm just there to take pictures, you know? And I wasn't
I'm a
particularly,
correspondent.
yeah, right. I wasn't particularly scared. I was more concerned, you know, to get my head and ass down, you know. Even if they weren't shooting at me particularly, you can still get, you know, you can still get hit with one of those stray bullets flying around. So, yeah, but then when you start seeing the casualties, you know, guys start getting hit and shot like that, then you start being a lot more serious about your training, stuff you learned in, well, for me anyway, in infantry training about how to acquit yourself and how to move around when you're under fire. So I think Alan Brook was, well, No Name 2 and Alan Brook were probably the two operations where it seemed kind of dicey for a while on how the outcome could be. That's yeah, that does get you, that gets the adrenaline pumping, I'll tell you.
I was in, during the Tet Offensive, I was north of Da Nang, overlooking Nammo Bridge. I went out with a reaction unit to get I got some great stories. I went with them when the Main Force VC had taken the village, pushed them out into the sea. And I was in Hawaii twice. And my wife and I were I never wanted to go back to Vietnam. Now, nothing political. It's just there are too many ghosts for me there. And we were on vacation, and we were in Cambodia, and then went into Thailand. And we were in Cambodia talking to a group of Americans, and they were going to go over into Vietnam. And this one guy said, yeah, we're reading about it, you know, and the imperial capital away. I said, oh yeah, it is. It's an outdoor museum, you know, basically. And I got really shaken up just thinking about it. And my wife says, you know, I don't want you talking about that damn Way City anybody anymore. It just, you get the willies, you know, just thinking about it. I said, well, yeah, you know, I mean, I've met a lot of World War II Marines. You don't want to mention Peleliu or Iwo Jima to them. They don't like to think about that either. And that's the kind of thing, you know, that it does to you. Though I do remember, I still found the other day, I got some good stories there of some guys that got printed, and I'm happy I was able to do that for them. And you know, that's what you did there. And you kind of wonder what happened to some of them, you know, later on in life. You hope they came home and had a good life. You hope they found somebody to love them, you know, things like that. And a lot of them, it's amazing. Like we said, you hear from people all these years later, and it's like it was just last week we were doing these things with them. And I think in a way, I mean, we were kind of forced to be in the MOSs we had. I mean, good God, I don't think there were 15 guys in my MOS covering the whole 1st Marine Division, you know, actually going out there and getting
12.
stories. Pardon?
We had mostly 12.
Yeah.
Sometimes,
you know,
sometimes we'd have as many as 15, but most of the time was between 9 and 12.
yeah. You know.
Yeah, but you know, I've been trying to track down by going through all the photos in the National Archives, trying to capture off the index cards who the photographer was, to get a list of all the photographers, Marine Corps photographers. But you know, there were 1st and 3rd Division photographers, but then there was the Marine Air Wing had photographers, the Combat Information Bureau had photographers, and it just goes on and on. There, the 3rd MAF had photographers. there were a lot of organizations that had photographers, and I don't know if it was the same for the writers too.
Well,
If Third Bath or CIB or some of these other places had their Stars and Stripes, of course, and
yeah,
had their own.
that was the big kudo. Stars and Stripes, that's the whole Pacific area. And I had 2 of my stories picked up by Stars and Stripes. And that was like a pat on the back that, you know, it got that circulation. There's also, I found over the years, a lot of photos. And I know darn well it was first, but they'll say Department of Defense photo. Well, wow, that sure narrows it down.
Yeah, or official Marine photo.
Official, well, whoop-de-doo. I mean, you know, and you know, hey, that I swear that's one of Dennis's or Bill Dickman's from Way or something like that. Yeah, they'll just have a generic identification of the thing, which is too bad.
Earl, tilt your camera down. You're starting to slip out of frame there.
And your butt's almost on the floor.
Yeah.
Well,
You're slipping out, man.
I think you got me now. I'm
Yeah.
okay. Boy, I know you guys are able to keep a lot more hair than I did. I just thought I'd bring.
I think I'm doing pretty good myself.
Oh yeah. Okay, put the hat back on.
Well, I can tell you the good news and the bad news about radiation. One is I still got my hair. The bad side of it is I still don't have a stiff dick. So
Yeah, right.
Well,
it'll come, right? Promise me it'll come back.
no, you're done, fella. Forget it. I've been through.
Lord.
Well, that's it. You know, I had met a guy. I've used this phrase myself. A guy our age. He had a T-shirt. It said "Agent Orange, the gift that keeps on giving." And it just. Yeah. But
one other thing I was going to mention, you know, about taking photos in combat there, you know, you're trying your best to get a decent composition. The lighting, there's nothing you could do about it, but try to take advantage of the best lighting you could and stuff. But some other things you had to keep your eye open for. Some of these grunts had been out in the field for 3-4 weeks, and the crotch of their pants would just rot out. And nobody wore underwear over there. So
no, because it's worse.
Yeah. So you always had to, you know, when you're taking a picture, just make sure this guy's package isn't hanging out there in the wind, you know, because that was definitely going to be, that photo wasn't going to make it in the story. So, funny things I remember.
It would happen. You guys would be waiting for a resupply. They're still wearing the same old,
reminds me.
It was all rotten out. Your balls, you didn't have to unbutton to take a piss. Leaned over.
I'll never forget. Dale Dye and I were in Operation Ford together, and he got hit in the arm. And
I tried to share that picture, by the way, of you and Dale, but I don't think it came up.
I got hit with all kinds of grenade fragments. It wasn't that bad. I had 3 fragments in my hip. The battalion doctor gave me a local, dug them out. And I think we counted, I had 29 other, very superficial. But no one wore underwear because of it exasperated the humidity. You didn't want to do that. So we go out to the battalion aid station at 2-3, and I walk in. The guys remember me from other ops. I get up on this stretcher, and doctor says, "Okay, let's see here." He said, "I remember you. You were in Auburn." I said, "Oh yeah." So they pull my trousers down, and Dale says, "Didn't your mother ever tell you to wear clean underwear in case she had to go to the doctor?" And I never forgot that quip of his. I just thought, great timing, which, probably why he's been so famous in Hollywood. He knew how to do things. But there we are. This is on white. This is on sand, believe it or not. It's white sand on that. Well, that's the same peninsula, then. That's the same place where No Name 2 was, north of there. Then we're on
Baxter Garden. Yeah.
A month after that.
No, Baxter Garden was only a week after No Name 2.
Or 2, yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, Ford was before that, I guess. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. This was March. This was March 19th, I think it was. And we were in the sand. And Yeah, that was that was a real fun experience there.
Earl, you know what
We
strikes
went,
me?
The sand looks a lot like Gono Island. Remember
yeah.
any
Well, what
operations?
Gonoy? There's another paradise too, but
Oh yeah,
this place here,
went there 3 times, never won.
yeah, we were you know, had Ford there, and you know, that's where I started getting suspicious of how things are going. You realize, you know, we were after a whole battalion, they disappear. Well, you know, South Vietnam was basically an ant farm. I mean, they had a tunnel system there that, in fact, Fred Smith asked me one time, he said he'd heard that there was a tunnel system that went under the water onto Gonoy. Well, heck,
Wouldn't doubt it.
they started those tunnels when they were fighting the Japanese, for heaven's sakes, you know.
I did 3 operations on Gono between July
Yeah, how'd they
and
disappear like
September.
that?
We never, we got our butts kicked every time.
Well, you know,
they'd pop up no matter where you were, they were behind you.
well, toward the end of Allen Brook, they brought in the Seabees with bulldozers, and they just started leveling everything.
Yeah, we one night found a hole. I remember, you know, I think you were there too, Dennis. And somebody put a yellow smoke grenade down it and tossed it in. And like 50 yards away, some of the smoke was coming up through another opening in the ground.
Yeah.
They had, heck, they supposedly they had machine shops down there. You know, I read later that they actually had their own USO type of, you know, I mean, it was, they had whole cities there.
Yeah, but that was more up in the, not so much on Gonoy because the water table was
not
so
there,
low,
but other
you know.
places. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I wrote a story on Gono where we uncovered a mine factory. They were actually cutting up, 105 rounds and taking and making booby traps. And it was a good story.
Yeah, we got a place along the between Haivan Pass and Phubai called Phuhia Pass, and I know Dennis was there too.
Yeah.
And they had all these block houses been built by the French, and you know, we had candles inside for light. You'd be in there, and they had all this graffiti, you know, like Corporal Jean Le Duc, Premier Regiment Parachute, Étrange, and I'm going, same guys. We're probably fighting their sons, you know, the guys that were there. And I found very interesting, there was still the French influence. There are still people that spoke French, you know, that were older and everything, because it hadn't been that long since the French had been there. And I just thought that was kind of interesting that, you know, you're running across this sort of thing and thinking, you know, something's amiss here, you know, where they're doing the same stuff and everything. And, you know, for some of there were still some of the pitch, you know, used like beaucoup, you know, meaning very much, was part of the verbiage among the Vietnamese and us that we picked up with. TT being small, you know, little, things like that, was that influence.
Well, what other kind of slang or vernacular did you guys use in Vietnam?
A lot of words you don't do in mixed company. What I found very interesting were little Vietnamese kids that learned their English from Marines. And their verbiage was, everything was, I mean, they didn't do it on purpose. This is how they learned this stuff. Was, you know, they're picking and little kids learn a language faster than adults do, as anybody would tell you. So you have these little kids, and every other word is of a rather colorful adjective.
Well, you know, that's one way that we're able as veterans to separate the phony veterans from the real veterans. You only have to talk to them for a few minutes and ask a few questions, and you know whether they were there or not. You know?
I was very happy working in a newspaper exposing quite a few phonies. In fact, the guy was president of Washington, the Vietnam Veterans of America for the state of Washington, claimed to have been a Green Beret. He was a fake. In fact, he'd spent all of his time in the stockade, got out as a E2 in the Army. And here's the Vietnam thing. remember when the wall first came out, there's a lot of controversy about it. And I took my son to a slide presentation about the wall. And there are some Gold Star mothers there. And they, and these guys get up with all their, and one thing Bernie concluded years ago about these fakes, nobody lies about being a regular grunt. They got to be Green Berets, Force Recon. They got to have medals that made Audie Murphy look like a pogue, the whole thing.
It's impossible to find anybody who drove a truck or
no, nobody admits that.
Cooked a meal. They were all in long range reconnaissance.
Yeah. And so these guys get up and start bad mouthing the wall. And these women, and it hit me. You phony god bastards. You wouldn't talk this way in front of Gold Star mothers. So I went and told one of our reporters, Tim Hansen, I said, Tim, this guy's a fake. So he filed a Freedom of Information Act request, got the guy's record book. You talk about a brig rat. He never left North Carolina, for Christ's sake. So we did that, but Dennis is right. It doesn't take, I told Bernie, I'm in a bar one time. This guy claimed he was a Huey pilot. And he's getting free drinks. And he said, yeah, I got my Huey shot up. In fact, my bombardier and navigator were killed. I said, what? What?
What? Yeah.
And then another guy's telling me how he snuck up on some NVA and threw a block of C4 on their fire and blew them up. I said, no, it wouldn't. It needs a shock. It needs a detonator cap.
Yeah.
All it would do is make it'd be big whoosh, was all it would do.
Actually, we use C4 to heat water for coffee and stuff.
Or, well,
Oh,
you
yeah,
do it for
we
sea rats.
roll one up about the size of pea, and you had an instant hot cup of coffee. It was a great way to get going in the morning.
Yeah. But, some of these, like Dennis is right. You could hear somebody for 30 seconds and tell whether they're legit or not. I mean, there's just, in fact, National Lampoon, you remember that? They had an article 40 years ago, a satire, how to make people think you're a Vietnam veteran. It had all these things that you could say that, people would think, you'd
like
actually.
You were saying earlier, it's interesting when you meet somebody and they say, yeah, I was in Vietnam. And then you start what we call the gate opening. Oh, were you? Who were you with? Well, if you say the right thing, that one gate opens. You go to the next one.
You check it. You check each other out.
You check everybody out. It's opening gates, And finally, if they'll get to a gate they can't open, and you say, "Well, that's a bunch of bullshit. What did you do?"
I knew a guy who worked in one of the newspapers I was at. He was in Vietnam, so I said, "You were over there?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah, I was in the Army and such and such." I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "I was an admin guy. In fact, I was the R&R clerk. Every time I had $200, man, I was on a plane to Bangkok or Tokyo or something."
Yeah. I met a guy at a restaurant, Mexican restaurant one time. He was night manager, and I was standing at the urinal. He comes in to check the paper towels and everything. I noticed he's got a first MarDiv pin on his lapel. And of course, I'd had 2 or 3 margaritas. And so I said to him, well, my experience has been somebody either wants to wear that pin or somebody earned that pin. I said, which one are you? And he says, I was a Marine, but he said, I want to tell you right now, I was a club manager at Dong Hall for my whole 13 months. I never had any fight, never got involved in a battle. He said, I was just a club manager. I said, I want to buy you a drink. I said, you're the first person that I've met that's honest about it.
It's amazing. We were in the airport in Madrid, Spain one time, and walking by these 2 gentlemen, and they had these Marine Corps pins on, and I walked up, did the whole bit, and we get talking back and forth, and they just were so nice to me, wanted to know what I had done, well, your job, and everything. And I said, units I was with. One said, well, Bob here used to command that regiment. I said, what rank are you guys? He said, that doesn't matter. We were all Marines. And the one guy goes, I ought to tell you, Bob retired as a boot general. He only had 1 star. I had 2. But here's these generals. I mean, they didn't, hey, you were Marines that, you were all in something at one time or another together. But it's, you know, I don't know if anything in my life ever impacted me as that experience did.
Oh yeah, it changed our whole lives.
Yeah.
You know,
And I never thought that's what I'd wind up getting into in the first place. But I did. Now, this picture here was taken, I think, in this, yeah, it was at Red Beach. We'd get together every 3 or 4 months.
December, yeah, Christmas time.
Yeah. And I'm on the end, and there you are. You don't have your shirt on. You must have been
No, but I've got my NVA or my VC hat on.
Yeah, your storyteller. And there's the usual gang there with I think it was cold that day. Some of the guys had coats on in there.
Everybody standing up in the background was lifers.
Those, yeah, they had to get special recognition. The one guy, the 1 second from the left is Lieutenant Proudfoot.
Proudfoot. Now there's the guy.
Now we had to have certain things, had to have an assistant information officer. And this guy, he didn't hurt anybody. He was one of these guys that I wondered how the hell he got through OCS if I couldn't, you know. And he had been a motor transport officer.
Motor transport officer.
Now, the sharpest for Marine officers, the ones that go into aviation are pretty sharp. I mean, you know, that. But actually, the grunt officers have to be pretty sharp because they're trusted with people's lives. And by and large, the guys they put in a motor transport, they put in there because they can't get anybody killed. And Proudfoot was just a character and a half. I don't know what ever happened with him. I think he left.
He got reassigned to Cords down in Penang, and nobody ever saw him after that.
But I remember that, and he was I don't know what the hell he did. I mean, he was, you know, supposedly the assistant. Speaking of phonies, when I was working at the paper in Port Angeles, our managing editor comes up. He said, "We got a guy applied for a job here." I said, "Oh, you got to know him, Earl. He was the assistant information officer for the 1st Marine Division when you were there." I'm thinking, my first Proudfoot? No, it was some guy I never heard of. The guy lied. He made it up to put in his resume. And I thought, who in the heck could be so desperate as to admit they were in charge of us? You know, I mean, really. And I said, no, this guy,
really scraping the barrel.
This guy was, no, he was never, no, I never heard of this guy in my entire life, you know. And so they wrote back and said, we'll put your resume on file, or, you know, something.
But, you know, if you look at those 2 lower rows that are not standing, and you start counting Purple Hearts and Bronze Stars and Navy recognition, I mean,
well, you look how people wound up. I mean, there's Dale, who's the most famous Hollywood technical advisor there ever is. You know, how many Emmys has he won? Then Gus is next to him, did Full Metal Jacket, you know, the book short, then Full Metal Jacket, got nominated for an Oscar. Of course, he was in trouble for some stolen books. That's another story. We won't get into that.
They were on interlibrary loan.
They were waiting to slap the cuffs on him. But I just think that that's very interesting, you know, the people there. And I remember Dale, when he got out of the Marine Corps, he's working for some publication and quit. And he was going to go to Hollywood and do a technical advice company. Well, I'm all for that. Sherry, my wife didn't like watching movies with me. I go, that's not the way the ribbons are supposed to be worn. We never had, no, that's not accurate. They wouldn't have a right. You know what I'm saying? You know, we'd pick that. Dale says, I'm going to go there and I'm going to get things done right. And we're going, okay, right, Dale. Best of luck to you, old man. So I don't hear from him, and I track him down. He says, I got a movie gig. And I'm going to, you know, I said, well, what's this? He said, do you know Oliver Stone? I said, well, yeah, I've reviewed his movies for the newspaper. Well, he's making this movie called Platoon. Well, the rest is history, you know, with him.
But you know what you don't see when you look at these pictures, of course, I don't know if ISO lost anybody killed, but the photography section in our time in Vietnam over there, we lost between 1st and 3rd Division, 12 guys killed. And,
well, I remember when Pennington and Sully got killed. That really,
That was
I'm
in
still,
June.
I don't know if I ever got over that, tell you the truth.
That was in June of '68. Yeah.
They were,
And, but, you know, so it was an inherently dangerous thing, what we did. And, a number of our photographers paid with their life for it.
mhm.
So,
Poor guys got hit real, hit enough, he got hit enough times that's what happened. And I remember, Bernie got hit 19th of February. That's when I went back up the way. I was down 3-5 and I called in and said, well, Bernston's, he's not coming back. I said, oh, cripes. So,
It was a loud explosion.
yeah. And they, well, didn't they notify Carol you were going to be returned to duty or something?
Well, yeah, the first time was, after I finally got to the hospital in Japan, they allowed me to call. And
Yeah.
at the same time that I talked to Carol the next morning, the Marine comes out from El Toro and says that, we're just here to inform you that your husband's been wounded, but he's going back to duty. And she, well, I don't think so. I just talked to him in Japan. He can't move either legs or his right arm. So
one thing the Marines did was, I don't know if you ever saw that We Were a Soldier, with Mel Gibson. The Army did notify of telegram. I mean, they did that for a long time. The Marines, if you were hospitalized or killed, they had a person come out to your family.
yeah.
And I always told my parents, if that happens, there's one guy there, don't worry. But if he's like with a Navy chaplain, so when I got put on the sanctuary, the first sergeant from the I&I staff in Tacoma came out, and he was smiling. And here's what we know about everything. And then they send the telegram comes later, to let them know.
This guy that came out from El Toro told Carol, and she said, no, I just talked to him. He said, well, if you hear anything more from him, would you let us know? Because we got some confusion going on here.
Well, there was
so many casualties that they couldn't keep up with it. They didn't know who was where.
Well, they asked me when I was in the hospital, the day after I was wounded, I was in recovery there. They came in and they said, do you want us to notify your
which
parents?
They just said that because they have.
And I said, no, I'll send them a letter. I don't want you sending anybody over to notify them.
Well,
usually
if I could interject here, real quick. I wanted to go back to Gus Hasford. All three of you knew him very well, but Dennis told me a great story one of the first times I interviewed him about Gus evidently sending a lot of copied letters to women in the United States. And Dennis, do you remember that story?
Yeah, Gus and I were on Operation, I think it was on Operation Houston. We were with 2-5. And when the resupply chopper came in, there were some boxes of stuff just said to any Marine. And so we opened them up, and it was a bunch of goodies that a sorority from a university had sent to us. And there were also letters in there from the girls that had sent the stuff. So I took one to write to, and Gus basically scarfed up all the rest of the letters. And so he had me take a picture of him, looking, all warrior kind of guy, and make up some 8x10s. And then he sent them a mimeographed letter, which he personally signed, and an 8x10 photograph to all the addresses he could get off these envelopes. And then he wondered why nobody wrote back to him. He did some crazy stuff.
Oh shit, yeah. He did some crazy shit after he came home too.
Taking care of him. And he came back, and I remember this would have been 74 or 5. He had the book finished. And he honored me. In fact, if you look online, there's a couple master's theses done about Gus Hasford writing, various universities. They're online. And he honored me by using my name twice, my nickname, Crazy Earl, and he had me for the drill instructor. But when they made the movie, I was on vacation with my family, and they couldn't find me for release. So they made it Hartman, which is who they named Lee Ermey. Hartman being the maiden name of Stanley Kubrick's German-born wife. But at any rate, Gus honored me with this. And I come home one day to get the mail, and my wife says, Earl, Newsweek's reviewed Gus's book. I said, you're kidding. I get it. And the Newsweek said, to this date, was finest work of fiction they'd seen on Vietnam. Well, one thing was unique. I mean, it was like nothing other. Most of the ones were very autobiographical. You know what I'm trying to say. And then he calls me up. I'm at the paper a couple of years later, and he says, I answered the phone. I said, Earl Gerheim. He goes, Craze, you're based on a character in my book. I mean, he could just say the funniest stuff. He says, guess what? They're going to make a movie out of my book. I said, holy mackerel. Wow. Who's going to do it? He said, Stanley Kubrick. I said, Kubrick, man, this is great. Well, it didn't change, but Gus, if he'd ever worked a regular job too, he could have been a rich man. He comes up to Tacoma. 2 months before, he had 35 grand in his checking account, he told me. So Gus, Bernie and I take him out. I don't know where we were. I think we were in Lakewood, weren't we, Bernie?
Yeah, we were in Lakewood.
Yeah.
Nice
we're in this place.
He says, I'm going to take you guys to dinner. Okay.
Yeah, right. He went with us, and he says, I hope you guys have some money. I'm broke.
Yeah. And meanwhile, an hour before, he's telling us that he's got 35 grand.
Well, he did it one time.
Yeah,
right. And
Gus, I got several stories about Gus, and I won't go into them.
And
I'm the one that had to get his body back home out of Greece.
Yeah, when he died. Well, everybody was bailing him out when he was south in California. Bob Baer, one of the Snuffies.
Yeah, if he crossed over the California Oregon line,
then it was our responsibility. He calls him one time. The type of guy Gus was. He calls Baer in the middle of the night. He needs a ride home. What happened? You know that Volkswagen bus I bought? It blew up. What? He's driving the thing in Santa Monica, and there's something with the fuel line. He gets out, and the thing blew up. It's burning. So he calls, well, I'm down there.
He tells Ding, he said, we got to keep going because I never registered it. I just bought it from a guy.
Yeah, he didn't have it. So I was down covering the Rose Bowl in 81 or 82, and I'm down in, it's down, where the Pasadena, and I'm staying in Newport Beach. And so he and Baer come down, and we go out. We're down there in Laguna Beach, and Gus used to live there. And Gus is saying, hey, Ding, remember I lived here? And Ding goes, yeah. And he said, yeah, I had to leave. The chief of police, the manager of the Safeway, ran me out of town for bouncing checks. I'm going, geez. And the guy, it was just, he called me up one time and he said, what do you know about cars? I said, very little. He said, I think he bought this Jeep wagon, something like that. And he says, it wouldn't run, so I had him take it in. I said, well, what happened? He said, were you supposed to put oil in these things? And the engine had frozen up, and they told him they wanted $1,800 to rebuild the motor, something like that. I said, I just let him have the thing, let him junk and pocket whatever you get for it. But he was one of the most complex people I've ever met. He was also probably one of the most intelligent. His initial impression, in fact, I did a piece that was on a website about when he was first there. The lifers thought he was some goofball, and they just used him as a flunky around the hoop. He'd have to drive him down the mess hall to lunch 50 yards, make coffee for him. Finally, he gets out and he starts writing stories, and he really could get good angles. He had that ability. But what a character. And then when he died, I knew what was going to happen when he left. No one will take care of him. And he died of complications from diabetes and heart problems, and was living on an island in Greece. And I think Bernie hit it right. We were speaking at a workshop about his work at a college one time, and Bernie really nailed it. He said Gus had just run out of stuff to write about. He'd done the Vietnam stuff.
He reached that writer's block.
He'd done a really fun detective novel, but he was good for one good detective novel.
Well, he also wrote Phantom Blooper.
Yeah, that was a sequel.
Yeah, and when he came back from Vietnam, we were on orders together to come back to the States, but they sent me home a week early. So he didn't come till a week later, and I wasn't able to send all my contraband home, and Gus brought my K-bar home for me.
Yeah.
And when I was in Santa Barbara, going to Brooks Institute up there, this was in 70, this would have been around 74. He came up to visit me up there and brought my K-bar up. And about a year and a half or so later, I was working civil service for the Air Force at the Aerospace Audiovisual Service out in San Bernardino, and we needed writers who could write military scripts for movies and stuff. These are, in-house kind of movies. And I could not find him to get a hold of him. I tried to get him to come on out and work with us out there. And years went by, and I was working. By this time, it's in the mid '80s. I'm working up at Vandenberg Air Force Base, driving home, and I hear on the radio that Gus Hasford's been arrested for overdue library books in San Luis Obispo. And so all this time he was living just 30 minutes up the road from me, and I had no idea he was up there. I went up and tried to visit him in prison, and he had used up all his visiting hours with his lawyer. And I said, you better get another lawyer if he can't get you out on bond for overdue library books. Come on.
Yeah, it came down to 300 and some books.
It was supposedly 10,000
No,
books.
they found his entire life collection initially.
Yeah, and then once they sorted through it, got his books from the ones he'd borrowed and never bothered to return. Hell, I mean, I could have told those libraries he's never going to send that shit back. But, but at any rate, so when he got out of jail, he moved down to San Juan Capistrano, I think it was.
Yeah.
And I would go down to San Diego a couple times a year for conferences. So I went down and I was stopped at his apartment to visit him. And the manager said, he doesn't live here anymore. And I said, well, where'd he go? He said, I went overseas. And so that's when he had gone over to Greece or wherever it was over there. And that was, I never did make contact with him. The next time I heard about him, I was searching on the internet and came across this Professor Callie Tall over in University of Arizona who was using his book in a thing. And I contacted her to find out if she knew where he was. And she said, well, I guess you don't know, he had died.
Yeah.
But, the snuffy guys
on an island in the Greece.
Yeah, the snuffy guys, your group never really, I was never really much in touch with them, and I didn't know what the hell was going on. Dale Dye was the only one I ran across, and that was when we were making that Firebirds movie. We were both working on that movie together. But
a guy, he's gone, Grover Lewis, who was kind of like a Hunter Thompson type of, gonzo journalist.
Yeah.
Gus knew him, and he did a wonderful piece about him dying, called The Killing of Gustav Hasford. You'll find it online. He came up to the funeral and everything, and he did a very good job, about it. And I remember, in fact, you took him out to the VA hospital in Tacoma one time.
I mean, he was in bad shape. He was living under his brother. His brother was in the Army and living out of Fort Lewis. His mother was living with him. She was a dependent. And Gus was sitting there at the kitchen table day and night, drinking vodka and Colt 45. And so finally his mother called and said, Bernie, you got to come out and talk to him because he's not looking well. He's sick. And I got he was just terrible shape. And I got him into the VA, and the VA, put him on he was diabetic. And so they tried different medicines, which is what they normally do. And he kept going and rather than get rid of the one medicine, he'd keep it. And finally one day he said, Bernie, I've got enough of the diabetic stuff that I can go to Greece where I'm going to write my book. And I said, Gus, you can't use that shit. You don't know what the balance is. I said, you need to stay here and get it under control, and then you can go. But no, he had all the different medications that given him, and he left. And by the time he got to Greece, he was probably running out, and he was just, he did
He was drinking. He had hardly ever drank until that library book stuff.
Yeah.
He was good for maybe a beer and a half, and he developed a serious alcohol problem with that. And we knew this. We talked about it, that once he leaves, we'll never see him alive again. And then, of course, we got notified he died. You got his body back here. We had the service for him.
That was a story in itself.
Oh, that was something else. But, it was just a real sad thing. And he was just a completely different kind. Gus was a kind of guy that was very intelligent, probably wouldn't admit that, but he would read up on stuff. He knew I have a tremendous passion for art history, the French Impressionists. So Gus went one time and he got a whole bunch of books out on Renoir to read. So next time we got together, I thought he was a professor of art history. He could absorb this stuff, the way he could. And just amazing. And he was another one. If he'd ever been stationed back in the States, he would have gotten in trouble because he could not have.
I can tell you some more in-country stuff. When we got sent up to Task Force X-Ray, Gus and I flew up together on a C-130, and Gus had already called ahead and made arrangements, and the ISO shop sent a Jeep over the runway to pick us up. But they put us in you've seen pictures of these hooches. Well, they put Gus and I in one that was it was kind of divided in half by a partition, and half of it was for storing supplies and stuff, and we were living in the other half. But Gus wasn't real big on taking out the trash, so to speak, and it wasn't long before that whole place was a total mess. And I finally asked the lieutenant to put me in another place, because living with Hasford was turning out to be a real mess. And then we got called by this Navy, I guess he would be a Navy, like a lieutenant colonel, to go out on a med cap with him. And he was going out, his words, we're going out in the boonies to have this med cap. And he had a squad of infantry, grunts to take with us for security. And he said helmets and flak jackets for everybody. And I thought, Jesus, where the hell are we going? These Navy guys, they seldom leave the base. I can't believe where we're going. So Gus and I show up, and we get on the truck, and we head out of the compound there at Fubai. We go about a half a mile, and the lead truck pulls over and stops. And I thought, oh, Christ, we haven't even hardly got off the base, and the truck is broke down already. Well, it wasn't broke down. This is where we were going. It was the Ville right outside the base. And, the thing is, these Marines are trying to act tough and inconspicuous, and the girls there in the village all know these guys, and they're propositioning them or trying to sell them stuff. And I thought, oh, my God. And so Gus immediately peels off his helmet and flak jacket, throws them in the back of the truck. I mean, we're not going to need them where we are. But this Navy captain, I've got his name jotted down somewhere. I can't think of it off the top of my head. Boy, he got all over Hasford's case. And all Hasford did was he looked at him and said, aye, aye, sir. And he turned around and he walked back to the base. And I thought, you can't just do that. But he did. And I thought, boy, there'll be hell to pay. But there really wasn't. I think the lieutenant knew Hasford, and he didn't expect much different. And
that naval officer did come to our office, talk to Lieutenant LePage, who was a must, and LePage, and they left, and he just looked at, get out, okay, what are we gonna do? And I'd be in and out of an operation, and Lieutenant, there'd be a call from the company office. We're supposed to be on a work detail. One time we got into work detail cleaning the shower, and they only turn the water on 5 minutes a day. What are we supposed to do? So I'm sitting there, he goes, Gerheim. You want him for a work detail. But he's not here. He's on operation someplace. And I'm sitting there going, hey, thanks, Lieutenant. That's but I remember that thing with Gus. And the officer we had there, it was almost like a school for gifted children. You kind of, it's self-directed. Just let them do their thing. And their thing was,
we had our artist there too. Remember what was his
Wilkinson? Yeah. And every once in a while, Lieutenant LePage would type up a critique and put it up on the wall there for us to read. And their attitude was, as long as we're doing our jobs, once in a while they'd say, hey, like tell Stokey, you're supposed to salute officers, Mike. You're supposed to do that sort of thing, things like that. But it was like, why mess with something that isn't broken, which was the whole idea. And that's the attitude they had. And it fit all of us. It fit our personalities, fairly well.
As long as I came back with the pictures and you guys came back with the stories.
Yeah, what the heck?
No complaints. Yeah.
They were fine with us. And the Army started taking over Fubai as logistical support for the 1st Air Cav. And the Army was so much better supplied than Marines, it wasn't even funny. Well, the next hooch was some supply, and there's some Army E7 that our Top Wilkinson knew. They were good friends. They get together. Next thing, Top says, can every one of you guys chip in $10? I said, what's this for? Well, they'll sell us a refrigerator. I said, oh, shoot. Yeah, I could do that. And then a truck would pull up, and they'd unload 10 cases of soda pop. We had to pay for it, but you couldn't get this, through the Marines. And one of the time, Lieutenant LePage went over, you go to the enlisted club there and you had lukewarm beer. It was Ballantine. And what was the other stuff? Carling Black Label. Well, he went to the officers club and got 2 cases of Miller High Life and had them in the refrigerator. And I came in off an op. I got there about 10 in the morning, and he was at some briefing. And first thing I did was always clean my weapons. Okay. Then I had two decent stories I did. Well, then I started hitting the Miller High Life. So Lieutenant LePage comes in about noon. I'm sitting there. There's all these empty cans of beer. I said, hi, Lieutenant, I got 2 really good stories. And he just looks at me and goes, I should have known better, And Gus made some comment. Well, Lieutenant, you shouldn't have left all this beer around Crazy Earl. What's going to happen to it or something like that. But Gus was, luckily, the MOS we had. If he'd been anything else, he would have been locked up. I mean, I don't care. If he'd been in charge of changing oil in the trucks at the motor pool, he'd have done something there to mess it up. It would have gotten in all kinds of trouble. And he had quite
resistance was a term.
Yeah.
But he resisted it.
Just amazing. And, his death was quite a tragedy. It could have been avoided very much.
Yeah, we tried.
Yeah. And he got more jams. And we all wrote letters to the judge, try to mitigate the whole thing. He had and finally, didn't Clint Eastwood call and get him out early and read about that? I thought it was called the judge. He was sent to 6 months.
He did about 6 months in jail. Yeah.
He got out. I think he did. He was sentenced to like 6 for library books. And
he had that old attorney from L.A. that had been, sucked off most of his money, but he still had that same old guy. And
the guy that defended Lana Turner's daughter when she stabbed
and
the boyfriend.
And the thing of it is Gus thought he had an in because the judge was a Marine, retired Marine.
That didn't work.
So Gus's lawyer said, you got nothing to worry about. He's an old Marine. He'll take good care of you and everything. So Gus waltzes in there thinking he's just going to get a slap on the wrist. And then they take him out in handcuffs. I mean, he was shocked. Absolutely shocked.
What could go wrong?
Well, gentlemen, I think this is a good stopping point for today.
Well, this has been fun reminiscing. and it's kind of fun, you know, Bernie and Dennis and I kind of working together again. I think
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
that
it's
really
a lot of
made,
fun.
you know,
Corrective history.
well,
Well-
because eventually a lot of us aren't going to be around anymore. I know there's been plenty of oral history done, but I think with us, this is something you're going to be able to use with your students.
Well, it's considering the Marine Corps, as you've all mentioned, is a small world to begin with, let alone combat photographers and correspondents. That's an even smaller world. This is truly
Mhm.
special to have the three of you together. And it's an honor. The times I've interviewed Dennis, I always end things with, gentlemen, thank you for your service, and most importantly, welcome home.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you, Zach.
I'm
We'll
glad to
talk
be well
again.
home. I was glad to serve, and I'm just gratified at the wonderful guys I got to do that service with. And two of them are right here.
Dennis, you're down at Battleground?